Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the joint P&Z and City Council work session. Today's Monday, June 12th, and we will call the City Council portion of the meeting to order.
And we will call the planning and zoning meeting order. I want to thank the commissioners for their service.
Very good, thank you. First up this afternoon is item B1, which is to receive a presentation on the city, the citywide comprehensive plan and provide feedback. So.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, council members, commissioners, for joining us this afternoon. I'll give a brief overview of the plan and then turn this over to our consultant, Jason with Stantec. Erin is actually en route right now. We've had a lot of cancellations and a lot of delays in the air, so she should be here in about just a few minutes. But Jason will be able to provide details very specific to the plan. So the city's first comprehensive plan was approved in 1989, and over time this plan was split into separate sections, targeting the east side, the west side, and the central area. But in 2022, the strategic plan called for an update to these somewhat outdated plans, and also looked to unify the plan as one single document. On a side note, you'll see here in green, the I-35 Corridor Vision Study that was approved in 2021. That plan is not being affected by this new comprehensive plan. That plan that vision study will also work in unison with this new comprehensive plan that we're working on. What does the plan provide? Well, it does create a vision and goals for our city's future. It also provides the overall foundation of how land is going to be used within our city. Most importantly, this is created by the public through engagement opportunities that we held this year as well as most of last year. Essentially, this is how we get to the community's vision. It's also important to note that the plan provides direction for other regulations that we have here in the city. This direction helps staff in updating maybe outdated policies and regulations to be more in line with our community. We can also refer to this plan when considering CIP or capital improvement projects, as well as creating partnerships with other organizations to implement our vision. So again, I don't want to take too much of our time. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Jason with Stantec, and we'll go from there. So Jason, you can go ahead and start on slide number 5 and share your screen.
Okay, let me get this pulled up, and I'm assuming everybody can see that. This one. All right. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for being at the meeting. We really look forward to continuing to share our work. This has been a very enjoyable year to work with the staff and the community members in Farmers Branch. So what we want to do today is give you a brief project overview, but it's really about hearing from you. So hopefully we can, as we get into some of these topics, going over the agenda, let me back up here. Sorry about that. As we go through the agenda, we're really going to spend most of our time on the different plan elements, as you'll see when we get there. So we'll give you a little bit of an overview presentation and then ask from comments from the room. Just a quick brief introduction for the project. So we've been working on this about a year now, and we've had, this has been with staff. We've had a great relationship with staff and have really enjoyed that. The community members and then focus stakeholders. We've been, as you see here, we've had 3 engagement pushes. First was last August, and followed by December, and then in May. And this is really these engagement pushes, these multi-day events, is what really helps us to collect information as consultants and then work with the community to fine-tune that to what is then the vision and the guiding values, and ultimately the substance that we're sharing with you today in our plan elements, as well as the implementation to really move this forward. Just a quick overview of our engagement. Again, those 3 engagement pushes were in August and December of last year, and then May of this year. These totals are for all of our engagement, but they do not include the attendees we've had at our pop-up events. We've had 6 separate pop-up events. 2 of those were at Employers Essilor and International Plaza. We had a Spanish-speaking only event at the El Rancho Supermercado. And then we've had 3 separate ones at Denton Drive Live, Family Night in the Park, and then at the DART station itself. All of these summary results have been summarized and posted on the website immediately after our engagement so that we have continuing two-way communication with the community. The Strategic Advisory Committee, or FAC, who is composed of representatives from various expert groups and members of the community, have met a total of 4 times, and they really have been our steering committee for this project throughout the process. We also have a TAC, or Technical Advisory Committee, which consists of other departments, their department heads, key staff members, and 2 members of DART. Throughout the process, TAC members have provided guidance. They've kept us apprised on city policies, procedures, regulations, all to make sure that our vision and the proposal that we've put forward is realistic and has the buy-in from the community and can be implemented from the moment it's approved. We at Stantec really pride ourselves on implementable plans, not something that just sits on the shelf. And let me just stop real quick 1 second. I forgot to introduce my colleagues who are here with me. So forgive me for that. But we have with me is Joel Mann. He's our mobility expert from our Atlanta office. Tom Layton is economic development and housing from our Minneapolis office. And then I'm from our Northern Virginia office just outside of Washington, D.C. And I focus on land use and community design. So I'll come up a little bit later and speak to that specifically. So the plan structure itself. So these intro pieces we've reviewed along the way. We've gotten, Farmers Branch now, a vision, which we'll share again in a moment, and our guiding values. But today we really want to focus on those subject matter chapters and top 5. We've created a list of top 5s to make it an easily approachable plan that is implementable. It really speaks to what we've heard through our review of engagement, which is heavy in our vision and guiding values chapters. The plan was really built around that. So we've listened to the community. We've really feel like we put forward implementation steps and plan recommendations that is based on our community engagement. The implementation program itself is framed around top 5 strategies, and we have consolidated where there is some overlap. So as we talk about the top 5 today, really be thinking about any issues that you can see with the implementation and the strategies to move those forward. That would be really helpful to us as we come closer to the adoption process. So a quick overview of our vision goals. So what we've heard so far, when we came out for our first engagement push, really well attended. It was great to get out and see the community very engaged. And a couple of key things popped out through our engagement. We do a few different types of exercises. One of them is called the Love More Less exercise. What do you love about Farmers Branch? What do you want more of? And what do you want less of? And you can see those results on the left half of the screen. But some of our key takeaways here have been really about people have been looking for a place to call kind of their central connecting place in Farmers Branch. They're looking for ways to connect throughout the community, whether it be through trails, sidewalks, transit, automobiles, et cetera. So we've looked at all of those modes of transportation because it has been very important to the community. People are also looking for more amenities. One thing I was struck by in visiting the community was how you had to go across city line to access so many restaurants and amenities that are just right there. So people really talked about wanting to have some of those amenities, restaurants and places to gather in Farmers Branch itself. And then one of the things people wanted to see less of, and don't we all, is crime and homelessness, and then empty businesses were something that popped up as well. We also had a couple other exercises. One's called a 6-word story, where participants write their, what's your 6-word story for the future of Farmers Branch? And then the final one was a bucket exercise, or a prioritization exercise that you can see on the bottom right that speaks to what people would like to prioritize in the community. You can see safety and crime comes out ahead, and then the other options not too far behind as they go down. But these were the top ones that we received. So the vision itself, and this is the draft vision, we typically will keep a vision in draft form until the plan is adopted, realizing that engagement and input will continue to come from bodies as yourselves, or from the community itself. So we really like to keep this in draft form, but I'll go ahead and read this out loud because I do think it's vital to the plan itself. In 20 years, Farmers Branch will be a welcoming, diverse, and evolving city that has everything our residents need. Our unique City in a Park identity is realized through our continued emphasis on high-quality parks, trails, and services. Even in the heart of the Metroplex, Farmers Branch retains a small-town feel that everyone can call home. Once we have a vision, then we create guiding values. These are the things that we aspire to that will continue, that will make sure that we're adhering to that vision. And I will say what comes from that in our recommendations in these subject matter chapters and implementation is all part of that engagement to the vision, to these guiding values. So still extremely important. And I'm not going to read each one of these, but I will call out that City in a Park and Parkland was very important. People enjoy what you have today. They want to maintain that and make that better if possible. I mentioned that people want to be connected. Super important. Connected to amenities such as shopping and restaurants, connected their housing, their jobs. But that can be through multiple methods, as Joel will talk about a bit later. Housing options were a key to what we've heard. People want to be able to age in place, stay in Farmers Branch, and live through all of their life cycles in the city while having different housing options. But people also wanted to see housing options for those who maybe were trying to achieve a dream that they may not have had or attain a dream that they may not have had the opportunity to do. So providing housing options from multifamily to single family is extremely important moving forward. Redevelopment is a key characteristic that we're seeing in most communities that we work with. So that is something that came out of our engagement is how do those strip malls and some of these businesses that maybe are not as vibrant or maybe there's vacancies, how can those areas be redeveloped into the future to enhance the livability in Farmers Branch? Diversity is a strength, and people wanted to continue that through being a welcoming community, having events, businesses, places to gather. And I will emphasize again, places to gather is really important. Farmers Branch continues to be a great place to do business, and we saw that firsthand, and we know you're in a great strategic location in the Metroplex to do that. And then finally, the city provides more shopping and dining options so that residents, employees, and visitors can stay, like I was saying, inside Farmers Branch and spend their money there. So we're going to start now. We'll focus on the key plan elements. We're going to go through one section at a time. Tom is going to start out with housing and then go into economic development and redevelopment. But we will stop and try to have a discussion at each one so that we can make sure we're capturing or making sure we're getting things right. And so we will put this back in your laps as we go forward to have an interactive discussion. So I can't speak for Joel and Tom, but when we get to the land use component, if you have questions as I'm going through the slide, please ask those at that time. I think that will make for a more fruitful conversation. So with that, Tom, I'll stay in control of this if you want to just tell me when to forward your slides. That sound good? All right, thank you.
Sounds good. Can people hear me?
Yes.
All right. I want to loop back really briefly to thinking about who you are as elected officials. Some of you on the Planning and Zoning Commission may be appointed officials. You may be elected to, I'm not sure. But this is a unique time when you're adopting a comprehensive plan. It's a unique invitation to think big and to think about, Jason has alluded to what kind of character you want to embody as a community and also what kind of character people feel as they live there. And you want to think about what's working, and you want to think about, what are the ways to, the big themes about where we want to grow. So it's both an invitation to think big, and it's also an invitation to think about, can we roll up our sleeves and make that happen in a way that we'd like to, and that now we have an opportunity to do. So that's the connection between the vision, some of these strategies, and implementation. So just invite you as we talk about all four of these themes to be thinking about, what role can we play in embracing this? There may be fine-tuning left to do, but in embracing this and in sort of being a leader in advancing this and marshaling the attention and resources that it takes to do the things that you think are most important. So I don't know if we needed that additional sort of pep talk or big picture thinking, but I am impressed when a group of elected officials comes together at this moment and is thinking about the next 20 years. So go ahead, Jason, to the first housing slide. So just big picture as we looked at your housing stock, you may know, you probably have a sense of this, but you have a very a strong housing inventory. You have your home values. You have home values that are healthy. You are attracting new development. There are a lot of positive indicators for a demand for housing development here. Now, of course, you're also a fully developed city. So the opportunity to develop is in redeveloping areas. You have been active even in single-family neighborhoods about infill development. So what we found in our understanding the market context for housing is some of that strength. You're facing the challenges that a lot of communities are facing in terms of housing becoming less affordable, particularly for those who have not already bought into a home, or maybe just bought into a home. It can also be unaffordable because mortgages are going up oftentimes. So there's a concern about the ability for people of ordinary means and maybe younger folks to be able to afford to move into the home. So we saw particular needs in the area of workforce housing or younger family housing and the affordability of that housing. Also, senior housing formats were needed. Next slide, Jason. In our workshop and survey, we got some of the same feedback. I guess I haven't read through this slide recently. I know that there was interest in people retaining their young population. Are there as people grow up in Farmers Branch, is there a place for them to be able to come and stay in Farmers Branch? There was interest in some of the housing formats that aren't being built. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because there are some, you're getting some redevelopment, but some types of development, there's some needs that aren't being met by the development that's happening organically. Next slide, Jason. So in this mix, we teed up and had some really good conversations with city staff. I spent some time talking with the developer community about what was going on in Farmers Branch and their interest in developing in Farmers Branch and why certain things were being built and certain things weren't being built. We tested out, a pretty robust set of strategies, housing strategies with city staff and our advisory committee, and landed on these 5 as top 5 that felt of most interest and would make the most difference in Farmers Branch. So I'm going to just give a very brief description of them, and then I think we're moving to conversation. So you've had a lot of success with your demo rebuild program in terms of taking out some of the housing in your single family neighborhoods that is in the poorest condition and attracting a brand new home, usually a much higher value home, so you're sort of leading the market there, and building new tax base. So we know there's an interest in continuing to do that, and it's a way of sort of recycling your neighborhood value. Have some implementation strategies associated with that I won't talk about right now, but we could get into if you want. You've also, in a Renaissance program, had a particular focus on building some housing that goes to a moderate income family that's more affordable. So we have a strategy that's about reinforcing that and doing it in a way that becomes a permanent affordable home, not just to the first person who buys it for a limited period of time, but in an ongoing way. There is, there is a lot of really large multifamily apartment development that's coming to Farmers Branch, but there are housing formats like townhomes or smaller apartment buildings that are not occurring. So there's a strategy associated with how do we foster some of those, either as part of larger developments where they can be a component of that, or in particular areas where that is appropriate. You are already engaged in a home rehab and repair program through a local organization that is focused on seniors, and I don't remember the other population, but it was focused on a couple of specific populations. And we're proposing that is broadened a little bit to include lower income households. And it meets a dual purpose. It's another opportunity you've got a little bit of an aging housing stock in your senior family housing. So it meets a dual purpose in that it recycles some of that housing stock and keeps it functional for the future, but it also supports a lower income family. And then finally, we heard from particularly some of the developers we interviewed, that there's an interest in having Farmers Branch continue to look at its development processes and the ease of moving through those programs, and in some cases some of the specific requirements. And it's just recommending a good housekeeping process of continuing to collect that input and make those process improvements. So those are the top 5 housing strategies.
Oh, Tom, I was going to say the one you had mentioned, it's seniors and disabled. So that was the other.
Thank you.
Yep, that's the other area.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I know Aaron has entered the room. Welcome, Aaron. Did you want to facilitate some conversation around this, Aaron?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Is this thing, can you hear me online too?
Yeah, we can.
Great. I'm off the screen, but I am here. Thank you for bearing with me in my late flight, and thank you to my team for getting us started. What we want to do is pause after we discuss kind of the top 5 strategies in each element, get some thoughts from you. So at this time, I think Tom gave a great review of where we are with our housing recommendations. I'd start out with the question for you of, do you have any questions about some of the strategies that Tom described?
I kind of want a clarification on a couple of the terms.
Sure.
When it says cost burden, so this was rental and owners.
Yes.
So if it's cost burden, that means they cannot pay for it?
Tom, do you want me to explain that, or do you want to take that question?
Either way.
All right. Cost burden is a term that's used by HUD, and it means anyone who's spending more than 30% of their income on their housing. So it's not to say that they are making less than what their housing payment is, but if they're spending more than 30%, it's not sustainable.
Okay. And then you mentioned middle housing, so as one of our needs. So is that a price concept, or what is middle housing?
When we talk about missing middle, and Jason is typing this up right now, we're referring to housing types that are in between the single-family houses that you have in plentiful in the central neighborhoods of the city and the high-rise apartment complex. So things in between like duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, courtyard homes and apartments, all of that. So there's a lot of housing types in between those densities. And of course, that increases your range of price points also.
Thank you.
Would a good way to achieve that is just by altering some of the zoning language to say that single family would include duplex or something like that?
You could certainly do that, yes. And broadening the types of housing that are allowed in various zoning districts is something that's becoming more popular. You can also, not just with the single family district, but with other districts, you can either create new districts that are in that mid-density range. And you can also allow missing middle type housing types in commercial or mixed use districts. That's something that we do a lot also. And I believe we talk about that a little more specifically in the land use section also. If you haven't, well, this is the first element that you've gone through, but you'll see as we continue the conversation that there's a lot of overlap in these strategies. So, and that's intentional. Yeah. Other questions about the strategies themselves?
Do we have any specifics on the process improvements that the developers are asking for?
Tom, do you want to elaborate on your conversations with developers about potential process improvements?
When you talk to developers, they oftentimes love to talk about, their projects and their interactions with the city. And I think it's important to tell you that there were a lot of really positive comments about Farmers Branch staff, but there were developers that, I know one specific comment that was brought up was about fire code stuff and sprinklers. There was another comment about having to make a lot of additional improvements associated with a lot of building-wide improvements associated with making a small modification to the building. These things can be entirely justifiable. So in having these conversations, I for one don't jump to conclusions, but I also know that part of maintaining good relationships with developers is soliciting input and demonstrating that the points of feedback that they are giving are taking into consideration that there are some modifications made. It's always helpful to have a more transparent, streamlined process, regardless of what the requirements are. So those are things that will always benefit a city as well.
And I was going to say, and I don't know if you ran into this, Tom, in your conversations with developers, but anytime you can save a developer money through the approval process, it's money that can go towards a project itself and less heartache for going through that process. So.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
So Aaron, thank you for traveling and arriving. And so want to reiterate a question and make sure it's presented here to this group. It was about the order of the strategies. You are not necessarily recommending any order in the way they're presenting. You're simply allowing them to be presented here, and then it'll be up to our bodies to figure out what the priority of them are. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair. So the order in which they are listed in your top 5 is not necessarily the priority order in which you should do things. We have talked to staff about adding some detail to the implementation chapter about what things make more sense short term versus things that will take longer. But no, the priority is ultimately up to you.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I kept thinking about when I was reading through some of the information and in a couple of different reports was, and I'll compare, even though it's not apples to apples, but I'll compare us to, say, Highland Park. Landlocked, surrounded by other cities, and everything there is pretty exclusive in terms of high value.
Okay.
Can't be all things to all people. Okay, so as a vision or somewhat of a goal that you're trying to broaden your city to appeal to more diverse population, but the reality is that may or may not happen, correct?
Sure, it's certainly reasonable to think of Farmers Branch in the regional context, and that goes for housing and for economic development, which I know we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. That not every city has to have everything for every person, certainly. I think what we're presenting here today, and I'll let Tom jump in on this also, is that The demographic trends and the trends in demand are such that we think you should look at some different types of housing to satisfy the demand that is here already, but certainly not that you have to have every type of housing everywhere. I don't know, Tom, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I agree with that.
Okay.
I will say in my involvement in this plan and attending those meetings, I did see, and it was apparent on the slides you showed where people were marking housing types they were interested in, that there is a great desire to potentially live in those, particularly as we mentioned, our senior community who's potentially looking to downsize and to look at other housing options that also provide community as a feature of how that development is built. And I think the same goes for our younger families who are looking also for housing developments that are community focused. And some of these missing middle housing types really have the ability to promote that sort of community that is of high desire by a number of our current residents, or you know, they would love for their grandkids to move here, you know, with their parents, or for them to look at as they potentially age in place. So I see it as, when we talk about diversity, there's a lot of ways to consider that. But within our community, I also see that as an age diversity and a diversity of family types, and really thinking about helping our community remain vibrant, which shows up many times in that 6-word survey. You saw vibrant was a big word there. And that means those younger professionals who will, in today's market, need those different housing types for affordability. It's just not present otherwise.
So that's a really good point. I think everything you just said was very valid. But I'm curious, how do you achieve that in a market where property value is just soaring the way it is, and to try to achieve developers to come in that will build something that will lend itself to those on a fixed income, like seniors, for example, because I talk to a lot of people, they're sick and tired of take care of all this, but they want to stay in the city. But yet, new construction or some type of I won't say family, but multi-single type or multi-couple type development for seniors is just, it in and of itself could become too expensive.
Those are market constraints, but I don't think, we can't predict the market going forward, but we do know our demographics going forward. So to your point, the need is there. The market, you know, there are those market forces, but the demographic reality is upon us.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, Tom, go ahead. I was gonna ask you to.
I think it's realistic to be aware that the opportunities, that there's not going to be an overwhelming number of opportunities for this. And so it's something that we've thought about in addressing this goal of having housing that meets the needs of different populations. It's come up already, but in some parts of town to allow, and doesn't have to be in every neighborhood, right? But to allow, to modify the zoning to allow some of these types of housing is one approach, and maybe just in certain selective areas that seem appropriate. And the other opportunity that we've been highlighting is in areas where you are seeing larger scale development, like in the Four Corners area where we might envision a larger scale development that has, you know, a set of different retail and housing typologies. In those type of settings, you can, you know, be planful about having that encompass a mix of different types so that you're meeting different population needs. Affordability of housing is an entirely different spectrum, but even in different housing types, you're meeting different household needs.
and if I could add to that, Tom, in the work we're doing, we find, and this is an emerging trend throughout North America, both in Canada and the US, over the next couple of decades, 70% of net new households are going to be singles or couples without children in the house. So empty nesters, young singles, young couples without children, people are having children later. So an overwhelming majority of the demand is being driven by households that will not have children, that have a greater preference for multifamily housing, greater preference for walking and mixed-use development, so walkability and having those amenities close by. So we are absolutely considering national trends at the same time, and we do feel that, as Tom said, there's a lot of demand for these types of units. And I will say that the economic development driver right now in 90% of the projects we work on is for multifamily housing. There's such a housing shortage and such a strong demand that there's just this great demand everywhere we work for that type of housing.
Well, how do you handle that when you have like your central core of the city here in Farmers Branch, and these single-family homeowners are saying, we don't want any multifamily in our area? Now, we've tried to push it off to the east side and to the west side, but the center being the sacred cow, if you will, that they don't want it touched.
So, I mean, that could be a long discussion. We're dealing with that in Nashville right now, where the community has enough multifamily. They don't necessarily want to see more multifamily, but again, that is what the driver is. And so what we've done is helped the existing property owners that are nearby, and we can work with. There's a lot of things you can do in regulatory environment to work with how multifamily would transition, or Four Corners, if there was a mixed use development there, for example, how does that transition and make a friendly neighbor to some of that single family? But we deal with that on a regular basis. It's really important to communicate to those people who are living in nearby neighborhoods that when this type of development does occur, it also, you may not like the multifamily, but again, there's things we can do to lessen that. But it's this additional development in the future that is going to bring those amenities that we're hearing that you want in the community: more restaurants, more open space, more connectivity. So there's a way to have that conversation, and oftentimes that will help people to understand when they start to see they're what they want to see in the plan, and maybe it's offset by something they don't want to see so much. But I think there's a way that these things can coexist, and we see it in most neighborhoods that we work in.
Yeah, I think I'd add that in addition to the bringing the amenities and the types of businesses that everyone has said they wanted in those vision charts, there are ways, and we address this in the land use chapter, through community design, that you, through different scales of housing, that you don't have to have, hundreds of units of attached housing necessarily together, but there are ways to insert smaller scale developments that are different than single family in. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for that with small scale redevelopment. So it doesn't necessarily have to be putting huge apartment complexes everywhere.
And I think your point about these opportunities will come few and far between. I think if you think of it the same way our developer rebuild, how it built very slowly, and now we've got a lot more happening with it. But I could see these sorts of things happening in a similar, very graduated capacity. So just because you change the zoning doesn't necessarily mean overnight we're going to have hundreds of these. They're likely to occur 1, 2 months pass, maybe a third, maybe years pass before we get a fourth. I think it's going to be a slow turnover, just as those opportunities arise for those missing middle types, particularly in the central areas. Maybe a little more on those light industrial transitional zones. We might see some interesting opportunities come up there. But in the central area where folks seem to have the most concern, as you said, I think they're going to be few and far between, and they're going to happen opportunistically at the right place, and we'll be able to review that as they occur.
Well, we're having one built there where the bank was. How many units is that?
Condos.
How many? Those are
41.
condos, but do we consider that multifamily when we have just a small amount? And then the people that are, the group that's right there on the way here, on the south side, how many units are those double-story? There's two groups of buildings. I think that's a very small group of units. So I think we have some of those that are coming in, and these are in our or metropolitan area, I guess. I don't know what to call that, core, yeah. But I think that we are seeing those, and that if it's on our radar a little more to do that. So I'm seeing some movement that way.
It's important to know that the comprehensive plan is a policy document that describes where those are appropriate. So one of the things you'll want to pay attention to is those maps that show, show that speak to that aspect of where multifamily is it's guided for multifamily and where it's guided for lower density development.
I think in that core area, they're going to be stymied by the land assembly issue. I mean, because you have those two particular developments and they had the land already assembled because it wasn't developed, but you're not going to find those, especially as you travel north. I mean, you're just not going to have those opportunities in that area anyway. You might look at duplexes if you had a really large lot, but that's a whole other issue. But they're not going to be at that
That's what I was gonna
size.
say. You gotta keep in mind the difference between multifamily and this missing middle segment.
And the
which we
accessory
actually-
dwelling units
And
too.
ADUs.
Correct.
We've got examples of all of this in little pieces around town, but, if you wanna put that into a policy and put it into your zoning, we'll see a lot more of it. And it'll increase density without actually changing the face of the city with, huge apartment buildings.
And, one of the tours that I did was that Beltline, stretch. And that's an area that would be opportune for that sort of thing. Again, easing into a more single family, but even on that north side of the golf course area, you already have tons of townhomes, that sort of thing. So it's just a continuation of that, use already, that we see.
It's transitional. I mean, that's the key here. You can have these things when they're appropriate with scale and the transition. You're gonna have a mix and you're going to have to drive with the market and allow what the market needs. But we've already seen the projections that we're millions of homes short in the state of Texas, and it's all over the country, and they've already alluded to that. But we're seeing multifamily, we have more multifamily going up in the DFW area than anywhere in the country. So that's what the market is driving. And so that is going to give you the biggest number of apartments, and they are something that we can control through zoning. Where do we want them? How dense do we want them? Those are things that come through the zoning maps that we have the opportunity to do. And I think others have already said it. I don't think nobody's gonna build multifamily on Highland Meadow Drive right now. I mean, that's just not gonna happen. You've gotta assemble the lots, you've gotta get size. That takes years, decades, in order to make those things happen. So what we're looking at is where there are opportunities, they are few and far between, but where does it make sense? Do we want to see that? And we're looking ahead 20 years, maybe 30 years, especially since the last plan is 1989. It took us a while to get to this one. So it is possible that this document lives, in perpetuity here until the next councils, down the line, have to deal with what is the result. We thought in '89 that we'd have a beautiful office complex on the, west side of town. Well, that never happened. Why? The market didn't manifest itself in that. We were either on the tail end of that particular cycle, or it just didn't happen with the owners of the property, et cetera, and probably all of the above. So we just have to take our best shot at what we know and what we hope to see the city look like. We've got tons of, residential and business area input, and that's what gives us this opportunity. And I think it's a fascinating time. We're gonna have so many overlays of what could happen in our community going forward. And it's not going to happen next week. It's not going to happen next year. And it probably won't happen until 15 or 20 years down the road. It just won't. So people will have to adjust to the transition, but what we're doing is controlling it. And we have the opportunity, both of these entities have the appropriate responsibility to control that going forward.
And I would just say it's something that going forward, it seems like it's as important to say what we're not doing as what we're doing. So if we talk about multifamily, but we are not talking about multifamily in your neighborhood. Like you can look at a map and you say, you hear multifamily, you're worried, look at the map. It's not coming to you. It's, it's, and be clear, it's here, it's not there. Because you're right. You hear multifamily and you think it's, and there's just a lot of places where it's just not going to happen. And we should be very clear about
Mega
that.
building, right.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we will revisit that when we get to the future land use map and whatnot. So very targeted areas, as you said. Before we move on from housing, is there anything that you feel like that we've missed in terms of our strategies that we should be talking about?
Well, you didn't talk about the neighborhood revitalization, which is different from the rehab and repair. That is a strategy that the city put into motion a number of years ago, where they identified a target area and the city was purchasing property to resell to developers, or for development, I should say.
I think I heard that mentioned when we talked about the community land trust, because my understanding is that land trust concept really takes what we've done with Builders of Hope and with the revitalization process and makes it more sustainable. So, again, these opportunities will happen in ones and twos. They're gonna come up infrequently, but we need to be prepared to have the opportunity to make moves in very similar to the revitalization process that you're talking about, but again, more sustainable, more long-term through something like the land trust. So I think I heard that mentioned, but mentioned in reference to really what we're doing is taking that, adapting it, and amplifying the impact of it with a more long-term sustainable strategy of the land trust.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think Tom can confirm this, that we're hoping that that program continues and we build on it and we do more. So, absolutely.
Yep, that's correct. Good comment.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to economic development. Would you like to take that, Tom, or would you like me to assume the responsibility?
I mean, I can keep
Great.
going.
Okay.
Again, you have such a strong economic base. I'm sure there are a lot of communities in the Metroplex that are, that look on Farmers Branch and wish they had this concentration of businesses. Just a huge job base. Looking at the circles on this map, the number of people who come into Farmers Branch to work compared to the number of people that live in Farmers Branch and work elsewhere. So it's just a real job destination. Also some signature office product. So in your industrial development has come in two different eras, right? So some of it is newer product, some of it is older product. And that's one of the things that really it's time in your city's history for Farmers Branch to pay some attention to is some of the aging industrial product. In terms of retail development, you have not been dealt as strong of a hand because you certainly have purchasing power in your community. There are people with means, but you're surrounded by lots of destination retail areas that pull some of that purchasing power out. And so in terms of the whole retail market that can be supported, and especially with at this point in time, the weakening of retail due to internet shopping and package delivery and that kind of thing. Retail in general, there's not going to be a widespread recapturing of retail or growth in retail in Farmers Branch. Having said that, it can be, like in some of our housing conversation, it can be targeted. There's a quality of a retail environment that, in terms of walkable retail, that is increasing in demand, and that can be a part of an environment in Farmers Branch. And particularly, we've really highlighted that potential again in the Four Corners area. So I think that's sort of a high level of how we understood the commercial market in Farmers Branch. Why don't you advance the slides, Jason? We identified through this process a number of catalyst sites, and where we saw that redevelopment potential is the strongest, and outlined, these maps are just outlining some of the assets that give those areas market value. This is around your Dart Station area, I believe. And it's one of those. I think we identified 5 catalyst areas in this project that have been given special focus. Go ahead, Jason. I'm going to again briefly talk about the 5 economic development strategies that we've highlighted through the process that we've talked about. Again, there may be things that you think are really important that we haven't highlighted. The first one is as we've gotten familiar with the environment on the east side of Farmers Branch, and it's a little bit of a mishmash between older industrial buildings and newer residential development that seems to have an entirely different population. And is it compatible? And is everybody happy with the redevelopment that's happening there and the congestion that Joel's going to have to address and things of that kind? And you've also got a college there that brings its own population. We see also on the flip side of that the seeds of an opportunity. And that is an opportunity to sort of reinforce an entrepreneurial environment through things like co-working spaces, to really capitalize on some of the younger population that's living in those newer apartment buildings. And some of them are going to be innovative entrepreneurs. Some of them are going to be in tech businesses. So to think about things like worker spaces that are sort of shared tools, to think about things like co-worker spaces, to think about tapping into some of the resources of the Dallas College system in terms of fostering entrepreneurship and business growth. So could take a lot of different forms, but just to be aware that you've got an environment where if building synergies between some of those components could result in a really interesting place that is a sort of an idea builder. So that's one. Number 2 is sort of noticing that you've got an awful lot of older industrial buildings. They're almost all being productively used still, but little by little they're becoming less functional. So there's a not only a private benefit to rehabilitation of those buildings, but oftentimes in real life, that rehabilitation doesn't happen because it doesn't make enough of a difference in how the building can be used. But there's also a sort of a public sector benefit to seeing those spaces rehabilitated. So those buildings can continue to be productive tax-paying properties in the long run. So there's a strategy about supporting more of that industrial rehabilitation. Number 3 is looking at these catalyst sets because it's a really valid economic development strategy to create places that are special and have character, and it markets your city and it attracts residential people living in Farmers Branch. So we note that as an economic development strategy as well as a land use strategy. And that has a redevelopment side to it, and it has a public realm side to it to create beautiful activated public spaces. And then the fifth one is the same as we talked about with the housing process, the housing strategies, and that is a continual quality improvement aspect to your regulatory processes. So those are the 5 economic development strategies that we've highlighted in this plan.
All right, thanks, Tom. Yeah, those are the top 5, although we discussed a lot of ideas in the chapter. I guess to get us started here, one of the first questions that I have is, do you agree with the catalyst areas? Because you will see them rediscussed when we get to the land use chapter. I'll note that we have, since the first version of the plan that we did, we've added the Valwood Josie Lane area, and particularly the northeast quadrant of that intersection as a site of focus, particularly when we get to the land use section. So have we hit the right areas of town, or is there anything that you think we've missed?
I was wondering about the west side of 35, just the other side of the Mustang Station area, why it wouldn't have been sort of included in a 20-year outlook as a catalyst area.
So I don't know if any, those of you online heard that, but yeah, the west side of 35 west of Mustang Station, and whether that could be a catalyst site also. We did carefully review your IH35W plan, and there are, part of that plan is to extend the form-based code over there, which I know you recently evaluated, and so kind of bringing some of that economic vitality across the highway and into that site. So yes, we didn't reinvent the wheel in that area, because you've done so much good work. But yeah, that is something that we should probably highlight in this plan as well.
Yeah, I think it needs to be highlighted, because not only does that continue the economic success of the Mustang Station area west of 35, but it's critical in connecting the west side of our town, which many believe live in Valley Ranch, right? So that area, I believe, needs to be probably more than a highlight in this study, because I think within 20 years, we'll certainly see that growth and change over there.
But I think that might just be a labeling type. I mean, we hope Mustang Station explodes, if you will, across 35 to pick that up. And so you're not talking about a separate area, to call it Mustang West or what have you. It's the Mustang Station. It just explodes over that entirety. So, but
far does
I
that
do
go
think it
west?
does say,
How far west does that go? I mean, that's just industrial. There's just a couple of, I don't know
Not
exactly.
quite to the railroad tracks. Remember, it stops before the railroad tracks.
And it goes west and then comes out and winds back around again. So
right. But then you have further.
They're pulling up a map.
okay.
Jason is our lover of
Okay.
Google Earth, so thank you, Jason, for bringing this up.
Yes.
And I strongly agree, and I think it's a naming and a concept of what we think of. It is both and.
Well, that's true. I'm in
I'm-
favor.
I'm-
Yeah,
I don't know.
and my understanding is with that I-35 corridor vision study, award-winning, I might add, that we,
Yes.
that in the early implementation, we have now designated for the first time ever, to my knowledge, that is a downtown area. So leveraging that designation as that form-based code, as you said, and perhaps that would be a unifying language that would help us rally towards that western side of I-35.
A little less important, but it also addresses some of the issues of Farmers Branch entry areas, which in a lot of places are invisible. And we want those to be highlighted as attractive.
So can we put that map back up there and
And as you're pulling, I will say it also
Point that?
overlaps with our arts and culture district.
Yeah.
So that's another important piece of that region and designation.
so the yellow is Valley View?
Yes.
Okay, so is it from, So you see where the hand is right there? Is it all of that over there
No.
south of Valley View, or where is that? Just right here?
That diagonal line or kind of is the railroad tracks.
railroad
And so like
tracks.
one block to the
Yes.
east of that is where it stops.
Okay.
Like, because
Right in
those
here.
buildings that directly align the railroad tracks are not included in that.
Yeah, so we're kind of talking about this. Yeah.
Just right here? Okay.
Right.
That was my question. Thank you.
I don't think it extends that far south either. I think-
Could, yeah, maybe, I was perhaps looping my mouse a little too far.
Yeah.
But that's a great point and something that we can make sure we do in the plan.
Clearly, you have Valley View and Luna on the west side with available space and the closer proximity to the development, the single family and the multifamily that's there. So again, it's a crossroads, north and south, Luna and Valley View connecting with the Bush, and obviously south to 635. So I think that's one that, in my mind, should have probably been up there.
Okay. Can you capture that? I'm writing down notes, but Jason,
Yeah,
can you?
I was having a hard time with hearing that fully.
That was
So-
Valley View and Luna.
Valley View and Luna on the west side. You have green space at the moment on the,
Yeah.
So a question about the east side. And I was
Sure.
gonna pull this up and verify, but I didn't want you to think I was texting during the meeting. But I noticed the other day on Apple Maps, the North Branch was on Apple Maps, like in basically the east side. And we had a developer not long ago mention the entertainment, like people are aware of
Entertainment district.
the entertainment district, which is, to us, we call it the east side. And so I'm wondering, is that concept in here as well? I mean, when I was looking through the plan, I didn't really get that sense, like, of the east side being something like an entertainment district. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I would say that that's not the emphasis that we've put on the east side. But Jason, I know that you did include some language about different areas of the east side, and particularly ones that might be more suited to entertainment type uses.
Yeah, and I think this gets back to what Tom was saying, is that you have different generations of industrial development. And I think the previous East Side plan kind of started to capture the essence of what the industrial stuff on the east side could become. And what we've seen throughout the country, it's these types of buildings have turned into, community serving amenities, restaurants, breweries, things of that nature. So that's part of the reason I think we captured that on the east side, primarily is the existing character and what the previous policy had alluded to. Am I answering the question? Did I hear it right, Aaron?
Yeah, I think, the question was, are we continuing, or how have we incorporated the entertainment district that's on the books now?
Yeah.
How do we balance?
I would say, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm wondering, just thinking of the makeup of the properties over on the east side, east of Midway, how do you balance what's there now with not and wanting to have more sort of uptown feel? That's another word that has been used, without overdoing it with the high-rise multifamily properties. Because I think that's one thing that, when you hear residents say no more apartments, it can grow out of control over there, because that area is probably fairly easy pickings for those kinds of properties.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we started looking at the east side and talking with staff about the development trends over there, one of the things that they let us know is that they felt like the current plan didn't give them enough leverage to focus multifamily development in certain areas. It was sort of like, this area is appropriate for a mixture of uses, and the mixture of uses can mean kind of anything. And so you're evaluating projects piecemeal and deciding whether they're okay or not. And that's allowed apartment development to kind of encroach on some of those residential or industrial areas, creating some traffic conflicts that we'll talk about later. And so one of the things that we knew we needed to do with this is to provide clearer guidance about where things are appropriate, where we don't want other uses intruding on the industrial areas, and where mixed use and higher density residential would be appropriate. So it's much more focused in that way, in trying to strike that balance between, we heard from the businesses when we walked the area and we've talked to them that they love being there and they have no desire to move anywhere else. And so that's something that we need to respect. As Tom mentioned, it's a huge asset for the city in terms of tax base and employment and all of that. And so we have created some industrial preservation areas, in fact, that we'll talk a little bit more about in the land use section.
And I appreciate that. I wouldn't necessarily assume that because it's a great, big, thriving business, that it's creating just all this great tax base for the city.
Fair enough.
I'm not going to name one in particular, but
Okay. Come on.
I'm just thinking that when I look at that area 20 years out, I kind of sense a little bit of like the Thomas Street area down near downtown Dallas. Where you have multifamily, you have townhome condos, you have some restaurants, there's some nearby industrial, but it's very livable, very mixed use, at least in my mind.
Right.
And it kind of feels like it wouldn't be that hard to get there.
Yeah.
Over on the east side.
Jason, would you like to, I know we're getting a little ahead of ourselves in terms of the presentation, but do you want to talk a little bit in more detail about our recommendations on the east side in terms of land use and the public realm?
Yeah, it will be easier to go over, I think, with a map when we talk about the land use. But I think part of the issue, and this kind of goes to what Aaron was saying, is how industrial and multifamily don't always live the best together. So our idea was to select certain corridors that would be the most likely for multifamily development or mixed-use development, and to allow that and really focus it on those areas to start to enliven some of these places. But I think the industrial preservation starts to, on the east side, really secures the future of some of these areas I was talking about that could become the amenities for that multifamily. It's really important to have a strategy short of, when I travel there, seeing an apartment building pop up here and there throughout the industrial area, you really start to lose the ability to create a critical mass of people in one area that would then lend themselves to those amenities. So it's really about trying to focus the residential while respecting the industrial, allowing both to kind of coexist with proper transitions. But it's all about wanting to create that critical mass of people for both amenities and for connectivity and potential, future bus routes, et cetera, any kind of transit. So, and focus the public space. If there's any future, I know there's some great evolving public spaces on the east side that can be tapped into, but when new developments come along, maybe it's a good strategy to be the city in the park to have or improve a public space that exists that these residents could also take advantage of. So it's really creating kind of more of a compact, mixed-use, walkable destination, but also allowing for that to access the surrounding amenities.
Yep. Yeah, so let's put a pin in that because we do want to talk about it more when we get to the land use. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions on economic development while we're here?
That St. Thomas area took years to develop. And at first they thought that was a bust. It wasn't going to be a good thing because of the 3-story condos and the whatever, but it has become a very vital area.
Right.
20 years, I think.
Yep.
You're right.
Well, we're thinking long-term here. We're
Yeah.
thinking big, so. All right. Well, shall we move on to mobility then? I'm going to turn it over to Joel to give us an overview here.
Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah.
So our mobility section had an existing conditions analysis that looked pretty extensively at everything. This was, vehicle travel. This was other forms of travel. This was looking at the infrastructure capacity, where there are gaps, where there are opportunities. I want to focus on a couple points from that analysis in this, though, because I do think they frame some of the big issues pretty well on their own. And the first of them is that the street network in Farmers Branch, and we're looking at an image here that shows the streets that the city controls and these color codings and line weights represent how much traffic is using the streets today on a per lane average. So this isn't just the total amount of traffic overall, this is the daily traffic volume divided out by the number of lanes. And that's important because the city, like most municipalities in Texas, has followed a master thoroughfare plan over the years. That's kind of the basis for how you get ahead of travel demand and roadway capacity needs. Those forecast out a future condition and start programming resources and funding to construct streets to meet that expected future condition. It's prudent planning, right? It sounds like a good approach. What it's ended up leaving you with, though, is a lot of roadway capacity that doesn't look like it's being utilized, maybe to the degree that it was forecast. We would say that's a good thing. That's opportunity, because it means that you've done some of the hard work in the past of acquiring additional right-of-way and setting those streets to function a certain way and be able to carry a certain amount of traffic. And if they're not carrying them today, and long-term trends in traffic volume would suggest that's not really changing, and it doesn't look like it will be changing in the future, that might be opportunity for you to rethink how that space, which is owned by the city, it's in the public sector now, is being used to meet other mobility needs. And we'll talk about what some of those are in a second. The next slide is another takeaway from our analysis, and that is taking a closer look at safety. We've done this around just, and when we talk about safety and transportation, I'll just clarify quickly, that's not so much, personal safety or safety from crime. That's, the safety of using the transportation system, the being able to drive without, getting into accidents or walk or bike without the same. So if the infrastructure in the system is designed so that people can use it safely, or limits those opportunities where collisions or safety problems can start to happen, that's a safe system. So we're looking at transportation safety in this, and this map in particular is focusing on a particular issue, which is crashes that involve bicycles and pedestrians. We did look at all the crashes overall that are just vehicle to vehicle or vehicle to a fixed object. Someone bumps into a light post or hits a mailbox or something like that. That's classified as a crash. But what we pay attention to when we're thinking about community mobility, especially around neighborhoods, is these crashes of what we call the vulnerable users, the bicycles and pedestrians who, I don't want to put it in such crass terms, but they're up against a heavy, quickly moving chunk of metal, and they're at a much greater risk of severe injury or, let's hope not, but fatality as well when those crashes happen. So we want to pay attention to this because it's a good barometer for where, one, there is activity, bicycle and pedestrian, travel demand, but it's pointing out where we have some real issues that we need to look at. What we usually see in any crash analysis, and this is kind of typical everywhere, is that the more traffic you have on a road, the more potential crashes you might have. That's kind of intuitive, right? You have more chance of something happening when you have just more, events or more people using it. What's really interesting though here, and I'm not sure if it's in a good way, but we're digging into it more. Jason, if you can just flip back to the last slide really quickly, kind of frame this image in your mind and remember that most of our neighborhood streets, and even some of the major streets like Valley View, as you get to the east of Josie especially, but even parts of Josie, this per lane traffic utilization metric, you're not really using your roadway capacity to its greatest extent. The green is up to 3,000 cars per lane per day on average. And a planning rule of thumb that we use for urban areas is that you can get about 10,000 per lane per day. That's full, that's capacity. So, using that very simplified metric, that's about 30% of your capacity being used on most of these streets, which should suggest these are free-flowing, easygoing streets. Maybe in some cases, like in the neighborhoods, not a lot of traffic. If you go back to the next slide, Jason, now look at this image and then look where a lot of these crashes are happening. They're happening on these relatively lightly traveled streets, especially relative to capacity. But the key thing is they're not just happening on Valley View, Josie, Webb Chapel, major thoroughfares. They're happening on neighborhood streets as well. So this is a real, concern for us and something that we start looking at trying to address. Because not only, is it not good to be having unsafe conditions for people walking and biking, especially in neighborhoods, it means that, the people who would want to access transit, by these ways, the people who need to travel that way because they don't have a car, households either can't afford it or have fewer cars than the people there and somebody needs to walk or bike, they're at more risk, and we don't want that to be the case. So we want to try to address this at the same time that we're thinking about those opportunities to repurpose right-of-ways. So the next
Joel,
slide.
I'm sorry, before you go to the next slide, we had a question in the room for you.
So
Absolutely, please.
I'm curious, couple questions. One is, over what period of time was this data collected for the bike and pedestrian crashes? And then secondly, is there any analysis to support that, say, per capita, we are greater or less than any other surrounding city?
Yeah, so the first question is the time the data is from. We typically go back 5 years when we do a safety analysis like this, but we were working on this last calendar year, so it's through 2021, because typically the agencies are only giving you like an entire year's worth of data at a time. So 2022 wasn't ready at the time. So we did 2017 through 2021 inclusive. So this was before pandemic, during pandemic, starting to come out of the pandemic. And then in terms of an analysis comparing you to peer cities, we didn't take a look at that. What is typically done in this kind of transportation planning, though, is to gauge where you are and your crash rates relative to a statewide average. You're above that. That's not too surprising. I wouldn't read too much into that because large metro areas, especially in the parts with freeways coming through and, a lot of traffic right there, tend to be above that average.
Well, large metro areas are going to skew the study or skew the number. So if, let's say, you compared us to a Richardson, a Carrollton, maybe a North Richland Hills or Bedford or Euless, cities like that, just to see where we are in the grand scheme of things. You can use any cities you want. I'm just throwing out some that seem to be near comparable size.
Right. And we didn't take a look at those in this just yet.
Can you? I guess my concern with this, if we're above average and we're taking into consideration that these numbers also included COVID, then they may actually be lower than what they truly are.
Yeah,
It's possible.
Could be more.
We can certainly take a look at that.
yeah, we'll discuss that with staff and see if we can get that information.
People were at home during COVID.
Yep.
Riding their bikes too.
Okay, I think, were there other questions
Other
before?
question?
I had one about the previous map showing the relative traffic. Anyway, I had a hard time reading it because what this seems to show us is the traffic carrying capacity. Is that correct, what the colors mean? Okay, does that give us any information on what the title is, relationship of vehicle traffic to roadway capacity? Does it give us any vehicle traffic information?
That's what you're looking at, is the relationship between the two. So the green, skinnier lines are where a travel lane in the road on average is being used less, or of less of its capacity.
Okay, yellow is a little bit more of its capacity, red
Yellow's
is
a bit
close
more,
to
and as you
full.
get
Okay.
up to red, the thick red lines, that's where the most traffic is. That's where over 10,000 cars per lane per day are happening. And just to clarify on this, we did remove the freeways, so the main lanes of 635, 35E, those aren't included. Those red lines you're seeing there, though, are the TxDOT frontage roads. So they, those tend to be treated as an outlier because they're, effectively part of the freeway anyway. They're sort of how the traffic, interfaces with the local network. But everything else off of that, stays within that 10,000 or less. That's the orange, and there are only a few cases of that.
I have a quick question too, just to clarify. So when I looked at this map, I assumed that this was showing actual usage and not like potential capacity. Is that accurate?
That's correct. Yeah, this is current traffic volumes.
Okay, so this isn't telling us a percentage of the capacity that it's using.
No.
All right, that's kind of.
Well, and
what we'd
that's,
like
I
to see.
think, Joel, that's what you were getting at when you were explaining that
10,000.
traditionally the capacity of a lane is around 10,000 per day. So that
Correct.
red is like the maximum capacity. If it's green, it's using less than 30% of the capacity per day.
That's what I needed to see.
Yep.
Okay, yeah.
Yep.
And Aaron, and Joel, if I may, I'll get closer to the mic. When you have the capacity, as we've just talked about, at 3,000, we have street differentials. Valley View is much different from a number of the neighborhood streets. So did you take into effect some sort of supplementary background information of the width of the streets? Because we have a lot of parking issues, if you will, and, you know, so tell me how you might have worked that component in, because my street might be different from Martin Street in its width. It's definitely different from Valley View, where we have 3 lanes in both directions, but we're talking about the capacity there. And so I think we've got a couple of different perspectives occurring simultaneously.
I would characterize it this way. This was kind of a first way of identifying a broad brush, set of opportunities. And then we'll talk in a second about the top 5 strategies that came out of this, as well as some feedback from one of our engagement pushes and the sort of community desires that we heard. But this was a way of first identifying what are we looking at in terms of overall opportunity. And as we drilled down into the ways that we could address that, we did pay more attention to the type of street and the function of street around specific recommendations. And that we don't have a map in this presentation that spells that out in particular, but the process that we used was using this as a starting point and then starting to think through what are the real implications of making change on some of these streets. Taking the additional 70% of capacity or so on these green streets on Valley View is a very different proposition than doing that on a local neighborhood street where people are used to parking. So to your point, to that question, we did acknowledge that to look at, right, where are the places where the opportunity to make changes is going to be more significant and more impactful in a good way and not create, other challenges that we are trying to move away from.
Yeah, and you mentioned already the thoroughfare plan, which addresses that as well as you have residential streets versus your thoroughfares. So totally
Right.
understand. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, we can jump ahead past this slide. So there's also, and Aaron, I'll let you, add to this if there are any nuances to communicate that I missed. But one of our engagement pushes did include a specific activity to go out and walk and pay attention to the condition of sidewalks, the design of streets and intersections, to identify these places where, at a really, visceral level, people feel uncomfortable. It's good to understand that if you're, planning at this high level, we can see things like looking through data like what we shared. But there's also a real world kind of, hey, we've got gaps in the sidewalk, or we've got places where this is really tricky to navigate around, or the sidewalks are narrow right up against travel lanes. So that effort and that kind of engagement with the community really helped us to, peel back a couple of layers and see, some of these more specific concerns. And I would say, the big theme that came out of that is connectivity, more ways that we can access community amenities, more ways that we can get access to jobs and make it easier to, live and work here at the same time. But safety was a big concern in that as well, making sure that it's not only safe kind of from a design standpoint, but that it's a comfortable and an inviting, kind of street design as well. So that helped us, to dig further into, and those 2 earlier slides with the maps are just 2 of several different kind of analysis lenses that we use to view this. But this helped us really kind of think through how travel in Farmers Branch is going to appeal, to members of the community. So the next slide is our top 5 strategies for mobility. And these really kind of get to those two, big themes from the analysis, as well as some of the feedback and direction we got from the outreach process. And that is to continue the work you've started in thinking about how to retrofit some of these larger streets. You've started that with thinking about Valley View, but we have several, the photo that were Webb Chapel. And this is near the north of the city, north city limits. And you can see this picture, 6 lanes. There are hardly any vehicles, in that southbound traffic road. Driving on a street like this, they might be thinking to drive faster if there's, not that traffic. Maybe less attentive to other users of the street. So there are certainly, opportunities with that. They'll need, the comprehensive plan can define, the specific designs you would use for those. So there would be additional kind of study and design work that happens when you're ready with those. But keep moving in that direction. You have a lot of opportunity. That's kind of the core of the strategy there. But the second 2 of these, items 2 and 3, are just, getting into the neighborhoods and finding a more appropriate way of doing that. Because, on that question that we just discussed, it doesn't work the same, to think about a street that has 6 lanes of traffic and, maybe not the traffic volume to really warrant that. It's different to think about a neighborhood street where you have parking and, a lot of other driveways, a lot of other things happening. So in the neighborhoods, we need a separate approach to that as well. It's not just about retrofitting the streets there because you've got the capacity. That's more about safety and where safety really comes in, because you do have that, pattern of crashes, especially for vulnerable users happening. So this is really, to put it in plain English terms, this is taking the traffic calming, approach that you have, which is kind of, it's the way it is in most communities. It's petition driven. It's really kind of tied to a couple of design options right now, at least kind of speed tables and speed humps, that sort of thing. And making this a more proactive approach where the city is getting in front of this and looking proactively at crash data each year as it comes in, understanding what these trends are, understanding how you kind of compare to neighboring communities, and finding these places where you can start working ahead of the issue and implement some traffic calming or safety-based enhancements in neighborhoods. The third one of these is just making sure people understand that this is an issue, because that's often the problem. The city can have great programs and the best of intentions to try to address safety challenges, but if people are still driving quickly because they can, or kind of used to driving a certain way or cutting through neighborhoods at high speeds, there's still that risk, and people need to understand just what is at stake for the community, from not motoring or traveling in safe ways overall. That's not just drivers either. That's people walking and biking and using other forms of wheeled transportation, needing to understand how to bike and walk safely. It's kind of everybody, and it's kind of all ages and all abilities and all parts of the community together. So we've outlined a series of strategic approaches you can take to start advancing a culture of safety in Farmers Branch, and working with your partner organizations like the ISD and other civic organizations to share this. And then the next 2 really get down to the walking and biking in particular. This is something that was identified as something people want to see more of in our outreach pushes that Jason shared earlier. And you have a trail master plan already identified, dozens of candidate projects and connections, but we've said make it a priority to go ahead and start working on a few key corridors that connect to some of our catalyst site opportunities and other areas for revitalization that Jason will talk about in the land use section. The 5th of them is a pretty kind of straightforward. There's a lot of sidewalks in Farmers Branch today, especially in the neighborhood streets, but we still have some gaps. So make it a priority to identify and start, chipping away at those gaps to fill them in. Usually this is something that happens with redevelopment and, working with a private property owner. And in the cases where you might not have that happen, have that development potential on the horizon. This is a case where the city might, take a policy direction to go ahead and fill those gaps anyway. So any questions on this, on the strategies?
I'm curious, you mentioned the policy development, with the sidewalk, but I'm also curious where in this top 5 would you see other policy opportunities? I'm thinking explicitly of things like Vision Zero or Complete Streets policies, walkability colleges or open streets events that impact both culture and policy in terms of helping people experience the streets in a more friendly way.
No, that's a great question. I think, in simple terms, those are things that could all kind of slide under the Safe Streets campaigns. And that this should not be, the Safe Streets campaigns approach should not be one of, trying to tell people what to do, but making it fun, to understand how travel around the community in different forms can really be an enriching experience, for living, working, visiting Farmers Branch. And I think that all those things could be methods or specific applications of that kind of an idea. So great question and great idea. We've identified that you can have it. We have other strategies than these in our recommendations. What we've done for each of the elements is to identify this top 5 as really the key push for the city to take. But there are others that aren't listed here. Some of those are in that other list of things, but I'm kind of thinking out loud that this could be a good opportunity to really make that Safe Streets a multifaceted approach that touches on many of those things, including those kinds of public events and bigger kind of policy frameworks like Vision Zero.
Great. So as always, I kick it off with, as Joel said, are there any of these strategies that you would like to know more about? And I guess I'll throw in an additional question. Since we've been asking questions about the strategies as Joel's been going along, do you have concerns with any of these? Because if you have concerns, we want to know those at this stage before we get to adoption, or any obstacles that you can see to implementing any of these strategies. Wow.
So I do have one. So I didn't see any mention about the piece of Valwood Parkway from B Street to Josie in that residential area. And I personally walked it. I think the committee walked it. Or maybe not the committee, but a group of residents walked it as part of the kind of workshops that you all had. And some of the feedback that I got from residents about that was that it felt pretty unsafe. It was really dark. Cars were driving by very quickly. And from my own personal experience, that was very consistent. Even though there's like a stop sign at every corner, people speed from one stop sign to the next, and there's flashing lights. I mean, we've done the whole thing, and it's still pretty fast. So I was curious to see how that was going to be addressed, and I didn't see that in here.
Joel, do you want to take that one? I think Jason is trying to zoom in on that area.
Yeah. In terms of the specific kind of focus corridors, I don't think that's one that we had identified. There's another part of Valwood Parkway that's wider, basically, and has a lower traffic volume, but that could be, we could extend that to include this part of Valwood, basically between Josie and B Street.
Mm-hmm.
What we've talked about is more on the east side of Josie over toward Webb Chapel, but that could be extended.
Okay.
And
I appreciate that.
I think your point is a great one when you say like there are stop signs, there are flashing lights, but the driver behavior is still to speed. And I think that speaks precisely to the type of, like you said, livable streets retrofits, that what they do is they help us as humans psychologically see the street and think, this is not a place where I want to speed. This is a place where I want to watch out for kids. there might be someone walking here, and it's a psychological experience of how you drive in relation to the form of the street and those elements. So I think the way you're describing that, tells me that that's a place where those type of retrofits would be well suited to help motorists know to be a little safer.
No, but that's a great point and something that we can include for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you think that there's anything that we've missed here in the mobility section?
If you mentioned this while I was I apologize, but
Sure.
mobility daytime versus nighttime. It's been mentioned a couple of times, and we know that there are a lot of really dark streets and, throughout Farmers Branch, particularly in the residential neighborhoods where perhaps our sidewalk maintenance is not all that great. Because infill the gaps in sidewalks was listed as one of those street safety items. But was there any thought or input given to the way people move about Farmers Branch in darkness versus in light?
Joel, did you hear that question?
Was that about light or lighting?
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
Particularly, yeah. So we did look at that kind of at a high level in crash data, because that's reported in each of the crash incidents, if you will, in the databases. They'll tell you what the lighting conditions were, what the weather conditions were, if the roadway was wet or dry. And it's typically the case that, more crashes happen at night. That's just, that's kind of common, in every community. I don't know if we saw any particular trends that popped out about that, other than, just a higher number overall. But it's something that we can, take a second look at to make sure that, this is accurately being reported on, and, any findings from that are brought forward in the plan.
Yeah, as we think about bringing in more density and walkability and connectivity, it's going to be important to have lighting that allows that in the evenings. We're building a glow-in-the-dark park right now and promoting that as it's hot in Texas during the summertime. It's going to be fun to play at the park in the evening when it's cooler. And as we bring and attract more people outdoors and to walk from residence to restaurant, lighting, I think, is going to be a very important factor in that planning. And so I'd like to see a little bit more focus on lighting.
On lighting. Yeah, that's a great point.
Do you feel, Richard, that it's really part of the safety aspect?
It is.
So I think
Absolutely.
they've given a couple of different, safety, improvements, whether it be the neighborhood or the safe street. So I think there's opportunity that the lighting could be worked into one or both of those particular elements.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think so. Yeah.
I will respond to one thing that I heard that really resonated with me is prioritizing the connectivity with those catalyst projects. And I think that goes in line with, the conversations we were just having about our East End and entertainment district and the corridors where there's more likely to be the multifamily development. And so doing those sorts of livable streets retrofits in concert with where we know the amenities are, where we know the people are. And including in those amenities, the parks, as you mentioned, with La Jolla and others, and our schools. I think, to me, Dallas College, certainly, there's some, happening there with that, but really thinking about our elementary, middle, and high schools as well as areas to prioritize around from a safety perspective.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Okay, any other thoughts about mobility? You have any concerns about any of this or things that you want to make sure that we cover that you haven't heard?
Well, I do have one, Aaron, and
All
I
right.
think it goes into the discussion of the amount of research that goes in. Obviously, we're a city that's bound by other cities. Did you guys happen to take a look at the other cities' thoroughfare planning as how they are looking at their street structures? I've had conversations in the past with our peers in Addison related to kind of the Inwood corridor, if you would, and perhaps doing some, activation is the term, the popular term now. But there's a neck of our community that doesn't have good east-west traverse there. So I'm wondering if there was any looking at Addison or Carrollton and even Dallas as our southern entry points on how they're looking at their transportation thoroughfare mobility perspectives.
Yeah, Joel, can you speak to the other thoroughfare plans and the levels we looked at? I know that there were some other jurisdictions that you considered.
Yeah, we did take a look at Addison just because of that issue that you pointed out. East-west connectivity in general is kind of a challenge, especially getting over to Addison and then, the Dallas portion to the south with Galleria. And try to understand where some of those connections, especially across the rail corridor, could be strengthened. It's not something in the top 5, but we did give some thought to those industrial streets. Jason's going to get into this issue a bit more on how the changing, kind of nature of that industrial area brings with it some potential street conflicts. So we were thinking through, what could some of those streets do? And then thinking through what, they're supposed to be doing over in Addison to make sure that we're, staying compatible with that.
Thank you.
I will also say to answer that, at noon today, I was on the NCTCOG, North Central Texas Council of Governments Transportation Plan meeting, which I attend every time it's there. Today I was virtual so that I could go here. There is a specific move similar to what you're talking about, particularly as the International District, which is the old Valley View Mall area, comes onto site. I anticipate that will be a huge, we're talking about catalyst internally, but a huge external catalyst that's gonna push that type of development into these east side.
Right.
And they're talking there about an automated vehicular travel, basically a people mover. And they're doing some early studies around that would be both within that development and connecting it to the Silver Line. And so I think there are innovative opportunities as well in that area. And as the Silver Line comes on and as that International District comes on board and we see the developments on the east side, and with the technologies as they're advancing, that we may find in the future that there are additional options that we're not presently thinking as realistic. I mean, these are rapidly developing technologies. In fact, the name of the project in Arlington is Rapid around these. So I'm in these meetings all the time. I'm very familiar with these technologies. They are coming at various stages of various types. And I anticipate that there could be that type of option. Again, particularly, I could see triangulating with the Galleria and International District with the Silver Line, and potentially even they're talking about, connecting as far west as here. Again, trying to connect then, to that other line. So
if what I'm hearing is a more influx of transportation, people coming through, whether they're moving through the various ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as I've also been listening here, I've heard that we're in an enviable position of 78,000 people coming in here to work regularly, which is additional people on top of that. We've had some discussions about the increasing some of this middle level housing, which could also increase our population. I mean, overall the population is increasing, as you see. So as I look at these livable streets, I have a little bit of concern regarding these 5, and these 5 listed all seem to indicate a reduction in lane usage or repurposing a lane for something else. So with all this extra influx of travel, I'm a little bit concerned, or we should be very cautious about minimizing this capacity plan with an expectation down the road.
I think it's actually
of
the
doing that,
exact
so.
opposite. I
Okay.
think this actually gives us the opportunity to take advantage of alternative tracks of transportation that are rapidly coming on board. And the people mover that I'm discussing wouldn't operate on these travel lanes. And it would also, again, these are new technologies, but I actually see it quite the opposite in terms of
Fair enough.
my understanding
We're on the
as
opposite
a
side, that's all.
transportation planner. Yeah.
So I understand you teach this, and so I'm trying to respect that. But in my mind, we have a city, growing population. We're also a cut-through city, pass-through city, if you will, for people coming to or going to Dallas or going north from Dallas. So it's really, really hard in my mind to justify the equation of increasing population and taking lanes of traffic or capacity away. It doesn't balance. And yes, there are all sorts, I should say, there are some different modes of transportation that are coming. But
And here.
understand that, but look, not everybody's driving an electric car, okay? But if you think about where we are not up in the Northeast where mass transit is the way of life. People still like their horse and buggy. They like their automobile. And so, I'm not sure that any of us are going to see a significant reduction of automobiles in our lifetime, because down here, people are dependent on that transportation.
I'll refer to Joel, who's also the expert, but I also know he's in Atlanta. And I moved here from Atlanta where I didn't own a car. And I commuted exclusively by transit and bicycle. I did that here for 6 months. And to your point, after 6 months, I was infrastructurally coerced. I had to get a car to get around. But given my preference, I wouldn't have bothered. I would be biking, and I still do, bike to Dallas College, bike to Dart. I bike to, Beltline Road and take the bus from there. I usually take the bus to the Carrollton station rather than Farmers Branch. It's a little faster. But I think these are, as you mentioned, generational issues. And as we're planning 20 to 30 years ahead, I can tell you also, as the parent of a teenager, my teenager is of driving age, does not have a driver's license, does not wish to have a driver's license. And that is increasingly a trend that we're seeing in the younger generations. And these mobility options serve that population, also our senior population that may have challenges with driving. I have a neighbor now who has friends pick her up from church to go to church. And, sometimes I, take her, do these things. And those are, again, the idea here is not what are we doing now? It's what will we be doing in 20 and 30 years. And the data and the research on all of these age populations shows a greater desire for individuals to utilize alternative modes of transit when it's safe to do so. And so that's what I experienced in Atlanta, which is also a sprawling city. That's where it's very similar in form to here. It really is. And similar things. People like their trucks and, that sort of thing. But I saw a huge shift in that mode share in the time I was there that I felt like when I moved here, I moved back a decade. So I'm telling you, it's coming. We're just a decade behind some other spots, but give us 2 decades, 3, as we're covering with this plan. And I think we're going to see a lot of utilization of those different modes, especially with the younger generations. And my students, you said I teach, they tell me all the time, they're in Arlington. It's so hard to get around in a different way in Arlington. My students, I didn't give them the assignment. They are, they have a new club called Walkable Arlington that they designed. Why? Because they want to be able to walk from the campus to downtown. And that's what we're talking about here, connecting so that it's not a pass-through city, so that it's a destination city, a place where I want to go, linger, stay, because I feel safe to walk to high-quality shops. And those high-quality retail only come with a walkability. If you want that quality, that's where it happens in terms of the retail space. Again, having been a former retail owner, And where I got my lease for my retail business was intentionally in a walkable area, so I get that street traffic. It wasn't people passing by. I didn't want the capacity of a pass by. I wanted people to see my business, not drive by it at 80 miles an hour.
Yep.
Joel, do you want to add? And yeah, go ahead.
I'll add really quickly that I appreciate the concern, and it's certainly something that went into our thinking that, you know, just because it looks like we might have some capacity today that we're, you know, not thinking about bigger regional dynamics. So there are some streets that don't, you know, show up green on that map. And talking about the neighboring connections, looking at Addison's plan, Midway Road, you know, is one of their two main streets. That's a major kind of north-south connection through. So there are some cases where we noted that even though it's a street owned and maintained by the City of Farmers Branch, and you know, you shouldn't have to be subject to the commuting patterns of everybody else in the Metroplex, it's probably not prudent to move forward on some streets. The other thing I'll point out, though, in the thinking about livable streets, it isn't necessarily that a livable streets retrofit means reducing the number of lanes categorically across a corridor. I think each of these will need, you know, some more design and kind of specific analysis thinking to understand how that might work at a corridor by corridor level. Because these are big projects to take on. You know, they're costly, they're kind of multi-year efforts. And that could include, you know, even if you're leaving the number of lanes where it is, more careful treatment of intersections, because that's where, you know, most of the crashes happen. You have to really kind of change the driver behavior as you're getting to the points where the conflict would be, but that doesn't mean that you're changing the overall capacity of the corridor. It could mean that in places where, you know, that capacity is needed, that you leave it and you focus it on certain areas. It can be things like the width of the lanes overall and, you know, using landscaping and medians and things like that to help kind of change and set different driver cues. So there's a pretty broad set of options for how those can move forward. They don't all need to look the same way. So I can appreciate the concern, but just keep in mind that there is a lot of room to be thoughtful and creative about that and still achieve positive results. And that doesn't have to mean you're going to create, you know, congestion conditions or something that works against the quality of life objectives from the rest of the plan.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point, Joel. And that was the only thing I was going to say is that when we talk about livable streets, we were honestly not using that as a euphemism for a road diet or something like that. There are so many different ways that we can make a street livable, even if we keep the number of lanes the same. And he mentioned a few of them. And each corridor that was identified would require a lot more study to kind of figure out what it should look like. So.
Well, if you look at the difference in the picture that you had up there a moment ago that was Webb Chapel going north, right by Oak Brook, there was a good amount of separation between an extra wide sidewalk
right
in the street, and of course the trees make it look like Anytown, USA, but compare that to southbound Josie Lane just south of Valley View Lane. We walked it, it's loud.
Right.
If I'm on a bike or trying to negotiate the sidewalk and the traffic, it's a little risky right there. I wouldn't suggest reducing the lanes, but simply by moving the sidewalk over 5 feet away from the street and adding some trees and other stuff could make all the difference in the world in that foot traffic along there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and some bulb outs and different things.
Sure.
There's tons of,
So I'm going to take a brief recess here.
Sure.
There is food, and I know you all have got a meeting at 6, so.
7, I think.
7.
Oh, I thought it was at 6.
No, the study session there's no study session.
Okay.
Yeah, study session.
All right.
7 o'clock.
Well, since food is here, why don't we just take a brief recess? Everybody go get some food, come back, and then we will resume, if
Sounds
that's
good.
okay. Probably
Thank you.
7 minutes.
All right. discussion. We've got one more element to cover and then implementation, and then we'll let you get on with your evening. I'm going to take over the screen here from Jason and talk to you a little bit about the last subject matter element of the plan, which is land use and design. The first bit of analysis that we did was the step analysis. And this map is different than a future land use map in that here what we're talking about are varying levels of intervention and change that need to happen in areas, not just what the land is used for. There are some spots where land use can and will and should change, but that's not necessarily the emphasis here. We came up with this step analysis map really based on our engagement with the community, our analysis of things like land use patterns, property values, things like that, discussions with staff, and to come up with this, the strengthen, transform, enhance, and preserve areas. What those mean are they're really different levels of interventions in the public realm and regulations that affect private property in each of these areas. So there really aren't any winners and losers. So we're not saying, oh, we're not going to touch this area, it's off limits. We're recognizing that the entire city could use, there are areas that could use improvement interventions so that we're not leaving anyone out. The preserve areas, which are twofold, the green areas, which are open spaces, whether they're private, like the golf course, or public, like your public parks and trails, the industrial areas. I hinted at this before that we've got some industrial preservation areas highlighted in gray on this map, kind of recognizing that your base industry is really important and we need to prevent intrusion of other uses into those areas. The transform areas, the preserve areas are where, we've got strategies that really relate to how do we keep these areas intact, maintain them, improve them where we can. Moving up to enhance, where that really takes in most of the neighborhoods in the city are in the enhance category, as well as the Mercer Crossing area across on the west side. And so those are well-established, already developed areas, don't have a lot of opportunity for infill and redevelopment, but nonetheless, there are some things that could happen in those areas to improve them and make them even better. And then we've got our strengthen areas, which is a little bit more intervention, areas like the Beltline corridor that we've talked about, the Valwood neighborhood, where there is some need for additional investment and some improvements. Transform are the greatest level of intervention. So those, if you look at the pink areas on the map, those roughly correspond to areas we've talked about as catalyst sites. So again, you're kind of seeing that overlap in these elements. We've got the Four Corners, we've got the Mustang Station area going west across the highway as well. We've got that Valwood, Josie Lane area up here where we did a walking tour. And we've talked somewhat about the east side as a transformational area as well. So we'll talk about these in more detail, but this was sort of our preliminary analysis that we did related to land use. We did produce a future land use map, so every good comp plan has to have a color-coded land use map because we planners just don't know what to do if we don't have one of these. That does lay out land use types across the city. The shades of yellow and orange are residential. The paler yellow is a more low density, moderate density, going up to the darker orange, which is higher density or mixed use. We've got commercial shown in the two different shades of red. We have these purple areas that, if I can get my mouse working, there's one over here on the east side and a big area that covers a lot of the I-35, the IH-35 corridor vision study that would allow some more flexibility with regard to whether you've got an industrial or a commercial employment use. So basically, we're saying in these areas that there could be a lot of creative uses for buildings that create jobs for people. Doesn't necessarily have to be just what we traditionally think of as industrial. But we do have the industrial areas on here, as well as public lands and park spaces. So this is, again, one thing that I'll point out here is we were discussing in the housing section where high-density housing might be, or higher density housing, or some of these missing middle housing types might go. If you're looking at this pale yellow that sort of permeates most of the city, we do have some recommended density ranges in the plan. So you could consider things like perhaps allowing duplexes in some neighborhoods here. But beyond that, we're really not recommending big density changes. The places where we see opportunities for a more variety of housing types are in the dark yellow. So we've got a little bit here. These are existing townhomes. I think someone mentioned this already. There are some in this Midway area over here. And then, of course, in Mercer Crossing, there's a mix of uses and densities there, too. And particularly, the mixed use areas, these orange areas, are where we would see opportunities to mix commercial and higher density attached residential types, townhomes, things like that. You're already seeing it in the Four Corners area, but these are the most logical spots where you might see a little bit more density. So we're pretty selective about where we are recommending that kind of change. So the top 5 land use and design strategies. There are a lot of strategies that are included in this chapter, but we boiled it down to a top 5 so that we could, we could focus our implementation a little bit. The first one is really to create places that people want to be. So again, trying to create destinations so that we're not that kind of just a pass-through city, but places where people want to gather, want to shop, want to eat, that kind of thing. So that create places strategy really involves not just what land is used for or what it's zoned for, but also how sites are designed, how buildings are designed, how the street is designed to prioritize pedestrians, things like that. And we would focus those strategies into those 4 sort of catalyst sites. So again, looking at Four Corners, Valwood area, the east side, Mustang Station, some of those key gateways into the community. Mixing land uses. So you could see from our future land use map that we have a lot of orange on here, which is a mixed use recommendation. So not that these have to be strictly commercial areas, but these are opportunities for, if there's going to be redevelopment, you have an opportunity to mix in some different housing types as well. And we think that's very important to creating all of these types of commercial places that people told us they wanted, right? They want places to eat, they want places to shop. They don't want to have to spend their money in Addison or Carrollton or anywhere else. They want to be able to spend it here. And to be able to sustain those businesses, we need to have some housing nearby too. Creating housing options was a big one. And of course, we talked about that a lot in the housing element, but really making sure that we have a range of housing types, integration of workforce housing into the housing options in the city, but also creating design standards for that kind of infill and redevelopment. So we don't want to create a situation where you have a very low density housing pattern and we immediately have extremely high density right next to it. That's not really good for anybody, but if we can create appropriate design, appropriate transitions, look at specific areas that are appropriate for different housing types, that's the way that you're going to get more diversity in your housing stock. Connecting residents to jobs and amenities. We talked a lot about this just now when we discussed mobility. That's very important from a land use and design perspective too, because again, to sustain those jobs, to sustain amenities, we need to have residents that can access them, whether they're in a car or on a bike or walking or taking transit or whatever. And so those connections really play into not just the economic development chapter, the mobility chapter, but also how we handle land use and design. And finally, you know, one of our goals, one of our guiding values is to continue to be a city in the park. So parks and open space are very important. You have a Parks and Rec plan, and we're suggesting that even moving forward, as you're re-examining that plan, to take a look at these growing areas that you have on the east side, on the west side, and what other amenities might be needed for those populations. Yeah, go ahead.
So, two questions came to mind. One, on number one, which was to create places. Those, you mentioned some that were shopping oriented versus, and I'm trying to figure out if that overlaps with prioritized parks and open spaces, because those are spaces or places also. And it's just, what is the goal? Is the goal for commerce, or is the goal for people to relax?
I
Okay, so I'm
Yeah.
thinking two different ways there. And then I was curious, do y'all ever do these, have you ever been hired by a transportation authority?
Yes, we
Okay.
have. And Joel does more of that work than my group does, but yes, absolutely.
Okay,
We
because, again, one of the thoughts going through my mind is when DART comes through, especially a town like ours, and eliminates many of the cross-city stops, that, not necessarily in our control, but that hinders or takes away opportunity for residents to use mass transit to commute to wherever.
Yes, that's true. That's a great point. Yes, we have worked with transit agencies like that before. To your point about creating places, I think we're not talking about any particular land use there, just that the places need to be accessible. Generally, as we've mentioned, they need to be walkable. They need to have a critical mass of something of interest that people want to go to. And so that could be focused around a park, could be focused around a job center, it could be focused around restaurants, entertainment, really anything. And so there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to that.
Okay.
Two items. One is looking at this east side, how you have the future land use, and there was another map. It looks like you've shrunk the size of the area preserving industrial use. And much as I'd like to see like a Bishop Arts Entertainment area over there, how much of the tax base have you thought about? Because as you've said, the industrial and the business use is an awful lot of our tax base.
Yep. So on the east side, what we've got here is the gray area is strictly industrial. This other purplish area is commercial industrial, what we're calling an employment center. So that's an area for some of those more entrepreneurial, creative uses that we talked about back in the economic development section. So
Still commercial tax base.
yes, right. So we're not talking about residential intruding into these areas. We're talking about keeping them business, employment focused, but just maybe not in the purple area. Things could evolve to allow some more creative uses. And we want to make sure that we're making space for that. You see, though, that we have a couple of corridors, as Jason was mentioning earlier, that we can already sort of see evolving to have some mix of uses. We're trying to be cognizant of the fact that there is some residential over in this area already. How are people going to get through to the rest of the city? And so we're looking at possible areas that could happen to.
I've got a really cool idea.
Yeah, what is it?
You know, if we can take a lane away from Valley View and put in a crosstown trolley. Take up that lane, and I would take that, because I'm tired of driving my car a mile and a half, 2 miles to go to Walgreens and pick up a prescription,
Right.
eat lunch and stuff like that. I don't know how much that would cost, but
That's a fantastic idea, and one of those creative things that when it comes to doing some pilot projects and testing ideas out, that's certainly something you can consider, because that would go through Mustang Station and the Four Corners and over to the east side where there's critical masses of residents, and potentially along Alpha, some transition into some commercial uses there too.
Aaron, one question for you.
Sure.
sort of has a couple of different applications across town, but has your folks talked about how we get from like across Midway, right? Or across 35 to get from, one area of mixed use to another? For example, on the west side of Midway, there's the Blue Lake Circle area that's really developed into something special over there with nice, multifamily dwellings. And that's beginning to now go across Midway because there's a new
Yep,
development going on at Midway and Alpha.
right.
And then there's the one that's already over near the Galleria, Alta Vista, or Al Vista. There's another property over there that's, going to be multifamily. So if that area that's in purple on the east side is going to be sort of the mixed use, entertainment, a lot of destination things going on there, how do we get people across a busy road like Midway? How do we make that safer?
That's a great question. Joel, are you still on the line?
I'm here, and I think going back to that, discussion point earlier about what the livable streets retrofits really are, it's a focus on things like intersections. You don't have to have the entire length of Midway, set up to provide safe crossings, but you do need them at a few locations. And we've suggested that Alpha Road, is an opportunity for one of those to be one of the top, kind of priority livable streets retrofits, and that's a great place where that's starting to interface with Midway to really think about what that looks like in a way that balances the bigger kind of mobility needs that a corridor like Midway is serving, and that means connecting into Addison and into Dallas on the other side, with what you pointed out, which is this real need to connect across it to tie together these community destinations.
Okay.
Wonderful. Other thoughts? I've got a little bit more detail. Let me share a little bit more detail with you before I open it up again. In addition to those top 5 strategies, in our Catalyst sites, we also included community design principles with each one of these. And this is just an example on the screen. But in each of those areas, we gave some recommendations to how regulations could change with regard to building placement, with the scale of new buildings to make sure that they're compatible with their surroundings, where and how much parking, pedestrian accesses and spaces, that connectivity thing that we keep hitting on, but also public realm things like streetscape and how transitions can happen. So getting back to the mayor's question about creating places and what that means, a lot of it relates to specific design. So some of this would go in your zoning ordinance when private development comes up, but some of this is for the city to use when it thinks about projects that involve the public realm and how to make it better. So I'll go back and ask if you have other thoughts, questions about land use and design. I know a lot of this we've sort of touched on before, so. All right.
I will just say, I know that we've postponed it, but we have a field trip coming up to look at the design district specifically in relation to that opportunities on the east side as that redevelops into more creative uses. And kind of thinking about that as an exemplar, of what could happen. And again, the co-location and the placement of something like the Meddlesome Moth, if you haven't eaten there,
Right. You need to.
Yeah, happens only because of the housing development that is adjacent to it. So I think you've set up very well in your plan, in that thinking about that pink area of those, what could emerge there that's creative, that's doing new things, adjacent to the housing options. That really makes it viable.
Sorry, taking one additional note based on what you just said.
Well, the other thing that might tie into some of this is, I guess, again, prioritizing parks and really trying to work to define what does that mean. We have 31, soon to be 32 parks in this city. So we have lots of parks, but are they the right kind of parks for what our residents of today need or expect? And so that might be a combination of P&Z and the park board taking a look at that to sort of reevaluate and just make sure that we're on the right track with those type of amenities that we provide our residents.
I think I would broaden that and say it's not just parks, it is making places. And if we think about the research on the third place, like when you're not at home, when you're not at work, where do you go? Where's your third place where you spend your time, your money, your efforts? And parks frequently come up in that, but especially when there's programming. And so for me personally, I will say as a resident, I have really appreciated the programming that we've done in our parks and the diversity of programs that we have offered that, to your point, meet that broad range of needs. So something like the historical park, it can be a family thing, it can be I had a friend who came from Oak Cliff who could walk to Bishop Arts, but came up here to visit me in Farmers Branch because we were doing the film showing of Encanto, and really loved all the vendors and the different thing and how that was set up and was so laudatory. So to me, it is a bit of that, yes, built environment plays a role, but more than just a space, what makes it a place is the programming and amenities and how people engage with it.
You see more and more around Dallas, the parks and the whatever, that they have a restaurant or they have a place for drinks or they have a place that, not just a bench, but a place you can sit down and visit. And it actually is a place that people are now going, many of the places in Dallas. And so those are the ones that are building around the high density places. They'll have just a very small place, but there's a place for social, not just kids to play, run around and slide.
That's a great point, yes.
Parents want to go
Yes.
and
right.
drink.
Well, honestly, even our library and those to me, like the pickleball at the library is a great example of creating a place, not just a space. And that combines the built environment with an activity or engagement so that it is, to David Merritt's point, activated, right? Like that's the buzzword.
Great point. All right, well, so I promised to try and keep us to 30 minutes. So the last thing that I want to go over with you today is implementation. And we can't leave you with a plan without knowing what to do with it, right? And we don't want to, while some of us really love plans, we don't want it to just be a reference document. We want to keep it in your hands when you are making decision. And so one piece of the implementation chapter is the decision-making framework. I'm not going to walk through all of this stuff on the screen, and the actual matrix is 2 or 3 pages long, I believe. But this is one of those tools that we've developed to try and keep the plan in your hands, so that when the P&Z or the city council is making a decision on a land use request, a rezoning, or the budget, or a capital improvement project, you can be reminded of what the guiding values are in the plan and ask yourself some questions about, well, does this decision, help fulfill one of these guiding values, or at least not run counter to it, right? We also provide you with some measurables so that you can go back however often you would like to see if you're making progress towards these goals. Some things that you can actually measure to take into account your progress. Most cities do this every year or every 2 years, so this might be something to keep in mind, not to create more work for staff. But so this is how we would like to keep the plan in front of you at all times. The next thing in the implementation chapter is a rehash of the top 5 strategies in each subject area and how they connect to the guiding values. So this is sort of a check on us, but also provided for you, to show that these strategies have a lot of overlap when it comes to your guiding values. So for example, our strategy relating to catalyst site redevelopment. That relates to the city in a park value, the creating great places to do business, creating places for redevelopment. I think we could also probably put a dot on housing options as well, because those catalyst sites really help us there too. So this is just to show that the top 5 strategies really are meant to work together to help you achieve those guiding values. And then finally, we get into some detail about each of those top 5 strategies. There is some consolidation here. So, for example, you saw a strategy in the economic development section that talked about reevaluating or doing some best practice with your redevelopment process, so looking at your process and making sure it's efficient. Rather than describe that twice, we just consolidated it into one. Filling sidewalk gaps showed up in a few different spots, so we consolidated all that into one. But really giving you a description, talking about what kind of resources you need to do each of these things, who your partners could and should be, and where you can get the money to do them. So not everything has to come straight out of the city general fund. There are grants, there are other types of TERS and other sorts of things that you can look at to create funding for some of these things. A lot of the housing programs that we suggested, we included language that would help make them self-funding. So new taxes from that new development can help go back and fund those programs and make them self-funded. So you'll notice that we did not include priorities here because, again, as you mentioned, that's really up to you. But one of the things, as I mentioned, that we talked to staff about is to at least organize these into some short-term, some mid-term, and some long-term things, so that when you're thinking about, okay, if we want to do this, maybe it's something that's a high impact strategy that wouldn't take us very long. So that might give you a hint about something you might want to do first versus something that is going to take a lot of creating political will and a lot of money, and you might want to stretch that out over time and do some study before you dive into it. So we are looking at adding that bit of detail to the chapter as well. So do you have thoughts on implementation and anything else that you would like to see in this chapter that perhaps you didn't see?
Well, if I were looking at the feedback that we got from residents, and this is part of the comprehensive plan, their number one concern was safety and crime. So I would say that part of our prioritization process should focus on what residents were focused on. One is safety and crime. The next one would be retail options. Third would be parks. So it was in that order. We're not going to gain a ton of retail options without density. So I think the byproduct of focusing on the residents' priorities is going to bring into that picture a lot of what we've talked about today. You did make a comment earlier, I wrote it down somewhere, but you made the comment that, maybe it was one of the other presenters that said, we're not going to have a retail recapture because of internet shopping and package delivery. So we won't see a recapturing of the retail that Farmers Branch once had. I wouldn't suggest Farmers Branch has a lot of retail anyways. We have Four Corners, we have Mustang Station, we have some other pockets around the city, but there's not, a vast retail area. So I think that the amount of retail and the locations of retail that we have today align well with what our thoughts about housing and density are for Farmers Branch. And just because our roads are 30% less or under 30% of their capacity doesn't mean we want more capacity or want more traffic. Just because our city can handle more density doesn't mean that we necessarily want more people. But as I mentioned a while ago, if we want a big name brand grocery store, we've got to pull in density in some way. Right. All of that, I think, is very balanced. So all that to say, the prioritization, I think, should follow the priorities of the residents.
Well, I think those feed in together. I think that, let's look at Four Corners and, let's look at anywhere. You always hear, we want more restaurants, we want more nice places to go, and that involves density a lot, but
Does.
it could also involve what that whole place looks like. It can involve a sense of place, that someone wants to open a store, whatever yours was, or something small. We want to keep we want to keep what's there. We love Messina's and some of those small places, but if those locations looked better and would attract higher quality stores, that's a sense of place.
Right.
Linda, I would argue, I don't think you're going to get that until you
Involves
improve,
density.
until you improve the housing stock around that area. And what's going to
yes.
improve the housing stock? Incomes. And you're going to have higher level of income around the area, and higher level of income will want better housing stock around there, and then that will become more attractive in time to any retailer.
But I think it's very much all involved together. To me, it's I don't want to move there until that's there, or maybe I don't want to build there until someone's already moved there. I think all of those are working together. So I know that we've talked about this as long as I've been on this particular committee. We've talked about it, you've talked about it, we all have. But I think that sense of place is a biggie that brings in and helps people want to be there, anywhere within Farmers Branch, a sense of place that you really love and look at. So I think they're all working together. I mean, I love the whole plan. I love all of this together. And some of the places in Dallas you look at, or look at Addison, it's taken many, many years to build it, and that's what we're saying. It'll take many, many years to build that.
Well, you say a sense of place. For those of us that were here in the 80s, you were one of them. That sense of place was Four Corners on Saturdays.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you went, to get all your stuff done on the weekends was to Four Corners. And I would suggest that today it's not that for the vast majority of Farmers Branch residents. And a lot of that, I think, is because I think our housing stock has yet to turn over to a point that businesses want to come back to the Four Corners and property owners want to invest in those properties. One other thing that you said is that, restaurants, and lots of people have said, we want more restaurants, want more retail. And I hear that. But what I really hear is, I want to keep my money in Farmers Branch. And I love that. I do.
I do too.
But we have, hustle and bustle in Addison for tons of restaurant options. We don't want to be Addison. We want to be Farmers Branch. And so, again, I think we're talking about balance here. And I think you're right. I think a lot of it all works together.
Yeah.
It does.
Yep.
And I think that's also what came to mind as you were talking about those residents' priorities is, yes, absolutely want to listen to residents and balance that with what we know is feasible and possible and within our control. And I think in my mind, from that safety perspective, Farmers Branch is thankfully a community where I know my neighbors and I feel safe because I know my neighbors, because I get to interact with them while I'm walking the dog, or I run into them at, one of our restaurants locally, or that sort of thing. And that really does give me that sense of place and home. Like, I don't know about you, but when somebody recognizes me at like Cox or somewhere, like that's just a thrill that you run into somebody you know.
Right.
And that sort of thing, I think, will continue to happen more and more as we build also this public realm that encourages people to be out and about, on foot, on bike, moving around outside of your car. Now, you can absolutely, no one's taking away anyone's car. You have freedom of choice, but there's also a freedom of choice to not have to use the car, like you said, to do those small errands. And if I'm out and about doing those small errands, that's when I interact and engage with those neighbors, and that's what knits together the community and creates the safety by eyes on the street. Just like you said, walking over here, you saw something that was brought to your attention and you thought that was unsafe.
you were able to make a call, but if you were driving past, you might not have seen it. And so that to me is a big part of that desire for safety, to me, comes in that building community. And that's easier to do when I bump into people face to face.
I will tell you, even as of today, it was the most. I went to Didn't Drive Live, met some new people. Their first comment was, "We love the fact that we could walk over here." It's like, okay, that's great. That's awesome. So it just is something that's been reverberating in me, because today, one of my first new patients was, I love the fact that I could walk here. Where else can I walk? Where can I get my hair done? Where can I get my nails done? Where can I go grocery shopping? Where's a primary doctor around here? And I was like, oh, so I just broke out a piece of paper and started writing. I was like, you just got to go one more block that way, and you'll be fine. And so that is what's coming in. And I will say, everybody that I've met that is saying that, they're not from here, and that's okay. But to her point, with the younger people, I don't think in the last 5 years, any of my younger staff have had a car.
Really?
No.
And I find it so surreal to me that they will pay for Uber to get to work.
Wow.
But they will. They don't want to drive. And it's just, I can't
It may not be
grasp
that they
it.
don't want to drive, they might not be able to afford to drive.
You don't know how you're paying for Uber then, right?
Uber, I think.
Remind me of something my husband keeps talking about. We live at Valley View and Marsh, and he wants to be able to walk to things. And part of it is this sense of what is walkable, because like when you actually look at where we live, we can make it. I mean, we walk a mile and a half is fine. So we can make it all the way to Alpha and Midway by going through Brookhaven. We can make it all the way to Mustang Crossing, but it doesn't feel Mustang Station. It doesn't feel safe.
No.
There are incomplete sidewalks along Valley View in our route to go either way. So we've got to cross in these weird kind of ramshackle ways, even though there are many places that we could walk across the bridge over 635 and get to Dallas but it doesn't feel like this walkable kind of environment. And I think that is a testament to that as well, because we want to walk places, and we are thinking about that for our next phase of life. Our kids are still young and we're rooted here, but like, where do we go next, right?
So I'm going to sort of pause this right here because we're really getting into the next topic items here. Let's ask if there's anything else regarding the comprehensive plan. I will say, I know a lot of work has gone into this. In my opinion, it's not the Holy Bible. It's a guiding document, but it's also subject to change. And we don't know what business may want to come here a year, 2 years from now, or what developer might want to build something here at some point in the future. And so while we have a philosophical guiding document, it's not the be-all, end-all, because something may come that doesn't quite match exactly what was said there, but y'all really like it.
But I think
And
that's where you
it's
go back to where you have mixed use. You're not necessarily saying we want, this thing here. You want these concepts here, and I think it's an overlay for that. And that's where, you're right, it's not the definitive. That's why we have an entire planning and zoning committee that goes through those particular processes and see what the value proposition of whatever is being, proposed for a specific, site in our community. So it is a guiding principle, but you don't want it to be so loose that you don't have anything bound by it.
Mhm.
So it's finding the balance. And if we want to retain the core of, single family residential, that's fine. But when we talk about our housing stock is single family, multifamily. Do we get into, duplexes, triplexes, all of those other things? And I think the answer is yes. It's not just single family. And we got to be careful, because if we're only talking about single family, you'll never get the density that drives the commercial part. You just won't.
Go ahead.
I have a question.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I want to go back to, I meant to ask this earlier. You mentioned that there was a particular walking tour that was done, that was Spanish-speaking at Super Mercado.
A pop-up, yes.
Focus meetings.
Yep.
Was the input from that tour any different than generally the input that you received on all the other tours?
Not particularly, and just to be clear, it was just a pop-up event where we didn't literally grab people, but we caught people when they were shopping. We didn't take them on a walking tour like we
Okay.
did the others.
Okay.
But what we were asking them about was, housing options that they might want, are there places to walk that they might want to walk to that they can't? And no, I wouldn't say that we heard a lot of differences in what we heard in the general feedback that we got. It was
Okay.
pretty consistent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just had a question, just to circle back to what Councilman Jackson had mentioned about density driving retail seems to be a general understanding among this group, I think. Does anybody know where we are with respect to density? Are we close or approaching that limit where we'll, or that to that level where we'll start to see some retail, or are we, what percentage are we? Are we at 10%? We need another 50%? Does anybody know, like, how far do we have to go before we can see that?
Yeah, before I turn that over to staff, I will say that it's, there isn't a magic number or a magic threshold that you cross. I mean, we have some general rules of thumb about, and businesses will give you all kinds of answers about how many rooftops they need before they see something as viable. So that's a pretty hard question to answer. But as far as where you are with density now, I don't know what or what trends you've been seeing with your application.
Yeah, no, that's something that we can definitely look at. I don't have, I don't want to lie to you, so I don't have an answer for you right off the bat, but it's a very important question. And I mean, we're looking at all of our multifamily stock versus, I know, let's see, Code just did an analysis on all the single family homes that we have. So there's good new data that's coming in. And with that data, and then the data that we have with multifamily, I think we can always bring back to the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council an analysis of where we stand here in the city. And
I just didn't know if there were retailers or developers that have told you, you need this certain level, and then we'll look at you a
Not
little stronger.
necessarily. I mean, some of the, like, for instance, when we did, gosh, what was that? That apartment on Luna, they decided to do retail on the very bottom. We weren't sure if that retail was going to be sustainable or not, but they had done a market analysis and found that absolutely it's sustainable. So I think it's sustainable in some instances.
So every grocery store, every chain, every big national company does an area analysis, and they probably each have different.
I'm just trying to figure out, are we close to their analytical level, or are we way off?
I think it's interesting too, he talked about that development on Luna and they wanted to do the ground level retail and then subsequent development say we don't feel like the market's there for that, right? And so it's case by case.
I don't think you can sit here and make a blanket statement and say, we have enough density to bring restaurants. Well, we don't. Obviously, we don't because we don't have them, but
Is it density or is it income?
Well, I think it's a combination of both, but every entity has their own criteria. I mean, Brinker spends hundreds of millions of dollars just analyzing markets before they put locations, in a particular market. So, they should know that their business, obviously better than we do, just like anybody who's bringing a multifamily complex. They do a lot of market research to determine what it is that's going to make best sense for this location. Will it justify it? Will it command the rents so they can fund their debt and make some profit? So, that's, and everybody's going to have a different metric. So
how has Roots become so successful then?
It's a destination.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
So that's the other part.
That's the other key
They
to
pulled
it,
from Dallas into
destination.
here.
They're doing just fine with no great density, and, they just made it worth coming
That's
to.
right.
they took a chance and they got a little incentive, so it all worked out.
That's a quick question.
Yes, sir.
Just in this So as you were saying, this is a high-level document. It's a strategic. And then ultimately, there are ordinances and codes. And I think I remember seeing in there where it mentioned PDs, maybe a more outdated way of doing planning and zoning. Like, does this have any recommendation about how we is there a recommendation about how we implement this into that level differently than we're doing today?
Yeah, I think, PDs are generally a sign that people are trying to do things that your zoning ordinance doesn't allow. And so if you're approving a lot of PDs, that's a signal that, well, maybe we should just fix our zoning to allow this and not have to put people through the PD process. And so some of our recommendations on mixed use and some of the new land use categories would help with that. That might involve creating new zoning districts, and that's something that you'll have to think about and study. But yes, I think it's good planning practice to try to enable the things that you want to enable.
Yes.
So if there are good projects happening and things that the city likes, we want to make sure those are baked into the ordinance so they can keep happening.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. It was a great discussion.
We appreciate it. We'll definitely be staying in touch so we figure out where we go next and
Yeah.
what questions we have. Because I'm sure as you all think about this further, you'll probably have more questions. So note them, and then at our next meeting, we'll review those.
Mayor, I think just to add one extra thing. So July 10th is when we plan to bring this to the Planning and Zoning Commission for the next public hearing. So we'll still have an opportunity to hear from the public, hear from anybody in this room, and then ultimately August 1st would be the ideal time to bring this to the city council, is what we're looking at right now, tentatively.
Yep, so
And
we
that
have
would
some time
also
to
Be a
make,
public hearing. Marcus, that would also be a public hearing?
Absolutely, Councilman. Yeah, it would still be a public hearing, so we're taking public comments all the way up until that meeting.
Very good. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, next up is item B2, discuss future planning and zoning commission and city council topics. So now I think it's an appropriate time.
To talk about what, the walkability or,
Well, yeah, you had made a comment that, some places have sidewalks, some don't. And, I would say if having a sidewalk plan for the city is important, and planning and zoning feels as that's something they want to suggest, then
Well, I
that
can't-
would be one of those topics.
I can't speak for everybody, but I know that certain development standards have indicated that we would like to increase to 6-foot sidewalks, right? Like I remember off of Valley View, and sometimes we make concessions about whether we move light poles in the middle of them. And I know down, and so I know that's one of our kind of goals
We
and
have made that an
standards.
internal.
I think there's some neighborhoods that would just like to have a 4-foot sidewalk,
Right.
just as something to start with, because there's a lot that don't.
Sure, and when you're talking about walking along public, like not just even residential roads, but when you're talking about on our major thoroughfares, it's not something you want to do, and especially if you've got kids. My kids are a little bit more mobile now. They're not in strollers and stuff anymore, but that's definitely cumbersome.
Well, keep in mind, we do have a plan for having sidewalk installed. Should somebody want that. I would say, obviously to do that on a larger scale, obviously it could potentially cost millions of dollars. How you do that, is that a bond or something else, some other funding mechanism? But
What's the percentage that we don't have sidewalks? Where do we not have sidewalks?
There's
I mean, is there a
many streets that don't have
Many that
sidewalks.
do not at all.
Entire neighborhood,
Yeah.
It shows that where we don't
the entire
have.
neighborhood has no sidewalks.
On the south side of Valley View from Mitchwin to Marsh, there's no
No
sidewalk. You
sidewalk,
have to
right.
cross Valley View to use that sidewalk. But then if you go west, if you go west, once you get to that first residential street past Johnson Outpost, there's no sidewalk going that way on the north side. And then you've got to cross back over the street if you want to stay on a sidewalk, right? Or you have to go into the neighborhoods and it's not necessarily as easy.
Marcos, are some of those are the easements there for sidewalks in some of those particular properties? I think that's another issue.
Well, yeah, and
That's an issue.
it could be the case, because the all sidewalks would go into the public right of way, obviously.
Right.
They wouldn't go into the private property side, so.
Right.
There's a good chance that, and I say this very carefully,
I
because we don't
understand.
have any from
It's-
Public Works in here, but most of these areas probably have that grassy area that's outside of the curb. Yeah, there's probably room for sidewalks, unless we're talking about varnish areas or areas that don't have curb and gutter, where it's more of a rural section. And I'm not sure if we have many of those here in this city or not, but I would like
I
to
think that, I mean, it's the
right
question
away-
of easement, so how much is, how much of easement has been used?
Aesthetically, it would appear that they have room to have an easement, but I obviously haven't validated
Measured it.
that. Yeah.
So,
Right.
Marcos, I was gonna, one of the things that, we can talk about sidewalks all day long, but I think on, maybe at a higher level, one of the things that I found was most helpful when I was on P&Z was we took a little tour of some areas that were developed in Richardson to look at some different housing stock. And then we also went over to Fort Worth on another tour, looked at Montgomery and West 7th, that area over there, to look at different types of developments. And where I think some of that might be beneficial is as we're considering the east side of the city and the transformation that the east side is going through, to think of development in a different way over there that would incorporate residential perhaps on top of some retail type of business, where you could actually incorporate some eating establishments and whatnot. So, maybe thinking about that a little further. Education in this field is really, really important, but it helps to see. Most of us are visual type learners, and so to see this sort of stuff, and you know what I'm talking about.
And I think hopefully we'll see that on this upcoming tour, to your point, that we're planning for that design district, because they've done
Yeah.
some very similar stuff.
When is that?
It's being rescheduled, pending the schedule of our tour guide, as I
Right,
understand it.
correct. We've been working with, from Master Plan, Dallas, with Master Plan.
Yep.
He's volunteered to also be a tour guide. Schedule didn't really work out this last go around, so we're looking at coming back to the Planning and Zoning Commission next month to
Okay.
talk to them.
Amber's
about
at
finding
Dallas.
a day.
Author.
I know in the summer it gets very hot, but if we all wear hats and we drink water, maybe we'll be all right.
We did it when it was hot.
No, right, and we have to move it to the fall, that's not a problem also, but we would love to see planning and we'd love to see not only the commissioners, but the council members.
Sure.
Come out there.
Well, just let us know, give some notice.
Absolutely.
Express the importance of shade trees in that,
Yes.
in that experience.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Not a tree.
Does anybody else have anything else on their mind as future topics of discussion?
I did want to bring up, I know that we had talked at our boards and commissions meeting about the need for, especially for our tree ordinance and landscape ordinance plan. And let me know, Marcus, are those coming up in June? And
Right, yeah, what we're planning to do is to bring to the Planning and Zoning Commission on the 26th of June.
Okay.
We'll be bringing an update. Now, the ordinances are still being worked on. Cura, one of our contractors, is working on that. So I hope to get a more definitive date as to when those are going to actually be coming through.
Because if they are going to extend beyond June, the understanding from that meeting was, Linda, that your term would be you'd be at the end of your terms.
Well, I was told I was not.
And I don't know the real answer, but the city secretary said that.
I've been told two things. So I was told by Sarupa, I thought it was, and she said, no, you're extended on. So I have no idea, but
Sure.
I'm hoping I'm here for that final.
Yes.
I
So-
worked on it for 6 years.
The item that I wanted to put on the thing is that in the case, and as we're, developing, I know that meeting will be upcoming as we, make those final determinations. Potential, and this was recommended, actually, thank you, by the mayor, for maybe a special, task force or something affiliated with those two plans so that we don't lose the expertise of one of our commissioners who,
good idea.
as you said, has worked on this for 6 years and been vital to it, and has a level of expertise I don't think we can replace. You're irreplaceable.
That's good to hear.
I think also given that we've kind of gone through 2 rounds of this with pre-COVID and then the big gap, and then it is something that
It needs to be done, especially if we're talking about constructing and reconstructing and adding in, and there's so many things that need to be done on that.
So I just want to set up for a future discussion, it doesn't have to be done now, that we have a structure or an idea of a structure or how that would work so that there could be some sort of task force specific to those 2 ordinances.
Okay.
To ensure that we have continuation of the level of, expertise and care.
Yeah, I think we could come up with something.
Okay.
Again, on the 26th, we'll bring in some details, and then let me look into that, and I can get you an answer on that.
I can't start over again.
So just to extend that a little bit,
By Sarupa.
what about a future task force for any item that we might need? Is there?
As a board, you have the opportunity to put a subcommittee together anytime to work with you all.
And can that be, can we bring whoever we want to be participants in
Typically, it would
that?
have to be less than.
It kind of depends what the purpose of the committee meeting is. I mean, if you have a subcommittee that's gonna go and work or study on some aspect of this, then if you want to have citizens participate, that's up to you, but staff's gonna need to know what you plan to do.
I just didn't know if there are restrictions that we need to be aware of.
Just come up with what it is that you want to do, the criteria, and then we'll run it past legal.
What did the members need to constitute less than quorum so that they could meet without having to post a notice of quorum?
Part of the problem, yes, if you meet less than a quorum, it doesn't require posting, but the whole idea is if you have a subcommittee that's gonna go and study something, come back and report to the full board about it, then the public's missed an opportunity to see and hear what the subcommittee's discussion was all about. So we have to be sensitive to that.
Sure.
So we may post or we may not, in case other members of the board decide they want to show up even though they're not on subcommittee. So we'll have to work out the logistics, and Mario can take care of that.
Yeah, sure. That's what I'm thinking is that on the 26th, let me do some research on it.
Yes, that's what I was
and then
saying.
Yeah, and then I can just bring it back on the 26th. when we-
Well, we should have a lot done. I mean, we're working on this a long time.
Oh, yeah, no.
We shouldn't
understood,
have to open
understood.
it up to the public. So,
The
Well,
ordinances?
yes.
Yeah,
for,
we
for,
do.
for the,
You-
for planning it?
No.
Or just for review?
presenting.
For review?
Okay,
To
that's
present the
okay.
ordinances.
Yes,
Those
of
have
course
to be.
you
don't
that's
wanna
those
open
all-
Yeah, for review and comment, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a standard sequence.
Okay.
I was addressing future
Future stuff, not.
future task force or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, we should have enough.
With
guidelines
guidelines,
out
we
there
need
that's-
some guidelines
Sure.
around that and structure.
Yeah.
There would obviously be some bumpers that you would have to be aware of.
Yeah. And in this case, to my mind, it's kind of a special circumstance where
Yeah,
it's a
this is-
continuation of a,
Yeah, just totally get this part.
As long as I stay within the confines of the law, that's all.
yes, yes,
Yes.
absolutely. Goes without
All
saying.
right. Council, does anybody have anything further for this? Okay.
Anyone on the commission? All right.
All right. Well, then, I'm going to adjourn this meeting at 6 o'clock. I would thank everybody for their time this afternoon.
Thank you.